This is Marrying Abby, a novella for the Brides of Clearwater series by Melanie D. Snitker. Read for you by Lynn Marie Brunk. Chapter 1. I still can't believe you agreed to meet him. This is a huge mistake, Abigail. Let it go, Mom. Abby Sinclair tried to ignore her mother as she finished preparing a large bouquet of flowers for delivery. Meredith Cunningham owned the busiest flower shop in Clearwater, Texas, and Abby had worked in it since she was old enough to do so. You need to end it. Put that nail in the coffin and move on with your life. With that, Mom slid a business card into the middle of one of the paperback books that Abby always had nearby. That's my divorce lawyer. He's fantastic, and he'll make sure you're taken care of. Mom ought to know, considering she was on her fourth husband. Abby resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She'd lost track of how many times they'd had this conversation. God, give me strength. We're not getting divorced. Tom and I have only been separated for a month. It's more of an extended break. At least that's how she chose to view it. Besides, she knew why Tom wanted to talk, and it had nothing to do with their relationship. The moment she realized that, it had been impossible to hide her disappointment. That you two felt you had to elope in the first place should have been a warning of how this marriage would go. As if Mom getting married in a church 3 out of 4 times had lengthened the duration of her marriages. In fact, Abby was certain those were the only times her mother had even stepped foot in one. It might have been one of the many reasons why, at the age of 12, Abby had started walking down the street to attend the youth group at a church in their neighborhood. It was one place where all of the drama at home couldn't follow her. Church was where she'd found solace from the constant fighting in her home and where she'd become a Christian. A year later, her parents split. When her mom decided to move them across town, the loss of Abby's church family had been devastating. She shoved those emotions back and realized Mom was still talking. It's not too late to fix this, Abigail. Thankfully, the store's phone rang, ending her usual diatribe. Abby double-checked the delivery address and tried not to think about her mom's words. Both of her parents had given her a rough time about getting married to a man only 2 months after she met him. Despite the fact that neither of her parents had stayed married more than a handful of years since they divorced each other, and sported 7 marriages between them, they were quick to assure Abby that her decision had been a monumental mistake. When they found out about the separation, she quickly lost count of how many times they'd said, "I told you so." Abby still had hope that she and Tom could find their way back to each other, somehow. If only it could be that simple. Had it been a rash decision to elope? Sure. Should she and Tom have taken more time to get to know each other first? Probably. But a mistake? It had been love at first sight, if such a thing existed. Despite their issues lately, she was still very much in love with him. So when Tom asked her to have lunch with him today, she couldn't turn him down. This would be the first time she'd seen him in nearly a month. Neither of them had made a move to reconcile their differences since they decided to give each other space. She daydreamed about him walking through the front doors at work and declaring his love. After the first couple of weeks, that daydream faded. Of course, she could have been the one to call first. Too bad they were both so blasted stubborn. Maybe it was time for Abby to bring it up. At least they might get something settled. Butterflies careened like bumper cars in her stomach just thinking about it. Mom hung up the phone and continued the conversation without missing a beat. All I'm saying is that you shouldn't let Tom drag this thing out, honey. I don't want to see you get hurt any more than necessary. I know, Mom. Abby set a roll of ribbon on the counter. Look, I'd better head out. We're meeting at Clearwater Coffee. It shouldn't be more than an hour, okay? She stuffed her backpack into her bag and slung it over her shoulder as she headed for the door. Bring me back a blueberry muffin. Abby looked around the crowded coffee shop and tried to squash the memories that threatened to push their way to the surface. Tom chose to meet here because they served the best coffee and club sandwiches in town. It had nothing to do with the fact it was where they went on their first date. After all, he wasn't nearly as sentimental about things as she was. He walked in a moment later and weaved through the crowd, his eyes on her. She expected him to be dressed casually. Instead, he was wearing his Clearwater Police Department uniform. She'd always been a sucker for a man in uniform, especially this man. Her heart tripped over itself as she said a silent prayer for strength. Abby swallowed hard. "Hey," she immediately realized how lame she sounded. "Hi, Abby. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late." "I just got here myself." She nodded toward his uniform. "I figured you'd be off duty." "I took an extra shift. We had several officers out sick this week." He turned the volume up on his radio, probably so he could hear over the noisy lunch crowd, just in case someone from the station needed to contact him. He motioned toward the line. "Shall we?" They waited for their orders and then grabbed a corner table where it would be a little easier to talk. Tom took a sip of his caramel macchiato and nodded approvingly. "I'd forgotten how good these are." Abby blinked at him. Tom stopped by Clearwater Coffee at least once a week. Or at least he used to. She'd avoided the place because she hadn't wanted him to accuse her of stalking him. Had he been avoiding her as well? Tom set his cup down and studied her for several heartbeats. "You haven't been coming here either." It was a statement, not a question. "It's been crazy busy at the shop lately. I've been eating most of my lunches there." That was a lame excuse. Tom had to know it, too. To his credit, he said nothing else about it. Instead, he took a bite of his club sandwich. "About my grandparents' anniversary cruise. We don't have to go, if you don't want to." "Oh my gosh, I feel horrible. I'd completely forgotten about it." Abby stared at her husband for several beats and mentally kicked herself. She'd known about the cruise for months, ever since his grandparents had announced they'd pay for the entire family to celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary on board. It was a neat idea, but with her own personal issues to deal with, the date had snuck up on her. "I'd forgotten too," Tom admitted. His dark eyes studied her as he ran one hand through his close-cropped hair. Everything about the guy was intense. It was one of the many things that had drawn Abby to him in the first place. He was ruggedly handsome, and his uniform only made him more so. He naturally took charge of situations, which sometimes annoyed her, especially when it involved her own parents. She took a bite of her own sandwich and washed it down with a drink of peach iced tea. "I mean, do you want me to come?" She tried to keep the hopefulness out of her voice. "Are your grandparents okay with me coming along after everything that's been going on between us?" Still wanting their grandson's new wife to attend when they weren't even living in the same house seemed a little weird, even for that sweet couple. "About that," Tom cringed as a hint of guilt shone in his eyes. "Will is the only one who knows we're separated. I haven't told anyone else." Since Tom was currently staying with his brother, he didn't have much choice there. Abby's jaw dropped, and she quickly closed her mouth with a snap. He rested an arm on the table. "There hasn't been a good time to say anything, and now that the cruise is coming up, I'm not sure how to tell them." When they decided to take a break over a month ago, she'd shared the news with her family immediately. After all, since she worked with Mom all day, there was no way she could hide her devastation. On the other hand, apparently Tom had no trouble hiding his. Or had their separation been less traumatic for him? She tried not to let that last thought depress her. This was yet another example of just how different they really were. Tom worked nights at the police department, while she worked days at the flower shop. That meant she went to sleep in an empty house, while afternoons left him alone at the house. But their differences didn't stop there. He was methodical, a planner. Compared to Abby's laid-back, hard-on-her-sleeve personality, it was no surprise they didn't always see eye to eye. Abby often wished she could react to the world in the same way he did. Then there was his family. Tom's parents and both sets of grandparents had been married for forever. Slight exaggeration there, but yeah. He had the kind of support she'd longed for growing up, while she, on the other hand, feared her presence alone might jinx their relationship. After all, failed relationships were her family's legacy. Was Tom hoping she'd agreed to go on the cruise? She hadn't missed the fact that he'd skipped right over that particular question. Or did he want her to bow out so he could pin the blame on her? She abandoned the partially eaten sandwich in front of her and leaned forward. "It's been over a month, Tom. You don't think living with your brother has tipped them off to our little issue?" Yeah, her voice dripped with sarcasm. Surely no one would fault her for that, given the circumstances. "I haven't told them about that, either," Tom grimaced. "You know how my family is. This cruise is supposed to be a celebration of love and lasting marriages. It doesn't seem like the right time to share that I'm not exactly excelling in that department." Despite her irritation, a pang of understanding hit Abby. It wasn't like it was with her parents. She couldn't imagine breaking the news to a family who valued marriage like they did. "I get it. Really, I do." She tried not to think about how excited his grandparents were. This trip was all they could talk about over Christmas. But what are we supposed to do? Go and pretend we're still okay? Just thinking about it had her heart aching all over again. Her throat tightened painfully. Pretending to be happy would be far from easy, especially knowing they couldn't go on separated like this forever. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Someone has to bring up the D word. It may as well be you." Her tumultuous thoughts must have shown on her face because Tom's insistent expression shifted to guilt. "Look, I should have told them all right away. I admit that. But at this point, I want to wait until after the cruise to break the news to them. I thought about making up a reason why you couldn't go with me, but you know Grandma. She's a pit bull." That was certainly true. Abby really liked Tom's paternal grandparents, and despite everything that had happened between her and Tom, she didn't want them to think she didn't care. She rubbed at a spot on her temple where a headache was quickly developing. "The cruise is for what? 5 days and 4 nights?" Tom nodded. "Yup." The tone of his voice suggested he wasn't so sure of it himself. "Will you come with me?" Abby sighed. She would get an earful when she got back to the flower shop. "Yes, I'll go, if it'll make your grandparents and your parents happy. Someone might as well be." Silence shrouded their conversation. Now was the time to talk to Tom, and she didn't want to push it off and regret it later. Even if she got an answer she didn't like, at least it would be an answer. Abby tried to swallow the lump that rapidly increased in size with every tick of the clock on the wall. "Tom, I think we—" She'd barely started when his radio sounded, alerting him of a potential break-in. He listened as dispatch gave him an address. "I need to go, Abby." Regret crossed his face. "I'm sorry to have to leave like this." Yup, Abby was sorry too, but understood he had no choice. So much for trying to clear the air. She bit back a sigh as she stood and wrapped up the rest of her sandwich before tucking it into the bag that contained the muffin for her mom. Once they'd thrown away their trash, they headed back outside again. "It's okay. I get it." Tom paused, his dark brown eyes hesitant. "Thanks for taking the time to meet me. It's good to see you, Abby," he said sincerely. His gaze rested on her face. "You look great." Her breath caught in her throat. "You too." With a single nod, he pulled at the hem of his uniform to straighten it. She gave him an awkward wave and then watched as he retreated across the parking lot to his squad car and then drove out of sight. So much for a romantic declaration or big argument, or anything that touched on their relationship, or what was left of it. Disappointment pulled her shoulders down as she walked to her own vehicle. Seriously, what had she expected anyway? Abby had often wondered whether being separated might change the way she felt about him. And maybe it had, in a way. But the attraction? Heaven help her, it hadn't diminished. The subtle scent of his cologne reminded her of the kisses they'd shared and the nights he'd held her in his arms. That bright, confident smile. It was the first thing she'd noticed when she met him last year. Tom had come into the flower shop to purchase a bouquet for his mom's birthday. The connection between them had been immediate, and Tom convinced her to go out to lunch with him that day. When he asked her to marry him 2 months later, she said yes without hesitation. Abby hadn't wanted a big wedding her parents could criticize in person, and Tom was desperate to please her, so they eloped. And they'd been happy, at first. But all of those little things they never discussed ahead of time started piling up, like how their work schedules kept them apart like ships passing in the night, or how Tom frequently reminded her that her parents, especially her mom, were constant negative forces in her life, as if she had control over the family she'd been born into. She could still hear their final argument in her mind. She told him she was lonely and missed him, that she wished his schedule would change to something more consistent instead of all the random shift work. Tom's eyebrows had drawn together. "This is my job, Abby. You knew I was a cop before we got married. Shift work is part of it." He raked his fingers through his hair. "If anyone needs to make a career change, it's you. It'd do you a lot of good to put some distance between yourself and your mom." Once again, their conversation morphed into an argument that neither of them ever seemed to win. She released a weary sigh as annoyance built up. "I won't quit working for my mom. She needs me there, and we could use the money. Besides, where else would I work? Unless you want me to take a night shift somewhere so at least we're on the same schedule." Tom immediately shook his head. "It's not about whether or not you take a night shift. I just think you'd be better off with less of your mom's negative influence. You, need a break from her." His words stung. "I'm not one of your cases, Tom. I don't need you to save me. I'm sorry, we can't all have perfect parents like you do, and you knew about my family before we got married." When he tossed her a look of annoyance, her own bumped up another notch. "Maybe we're the ones that need a break." The words slipped out of Abby's mouth before she could stop them, and Tom's expression immediately hardened. As soon as she said it, she wished she hadn't. She didn't mean it. To her surprise, Tom didn't argue. Abby's stomach fell to the floor. He remained silent for several painful heartbeats before finally saying, "Maybe you're right. Maybe we both need some space to think." And this time, she was the one who didn't argue. He turned away. "What are you going to do?" she called after him. He glanced over his shoulder. "I can crash with Will for a while." With that, he went to pack some things. As he reemerged with the duffel bag, Abby wanted to beg him not to go. Pride and hurt feelings kept her from saying a word. Tom stopped in front of her, his eyes searching. Finally, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Goodbye, Abby." She'd watched him go then, certain things would change. That he'd come back. But he hadn't. And she hadn't called him either. Abby tried to shake the painful memory from her mind. The time apart hadn't dulled any of it. Her stomach churned as she got in her car and drove back to the flower shop. Too bad she couldn't simply go home, eat her way through a bag of peanut M&Ms, and completely avoid the conversation waiting for her inside. Mom accepted the blueberry muffin with a nod of thanks. So, how'd it go? I'd forgotten all about his grandparents' anniversary cruise we're supposed to go on. Mom wrinkled her nose. I'm assuming you canceled. Abby's silence spoke volumes. Mom planted her free hand on her hip. It takes a lot of nerve for him to expect you to go. I ought to call him up and give him a piece of my mind. Abby immediately lifted a hand to stop her. I agreed to go, Mom. That's all there is to it. A bell chimed above the door as a customer came in. Abby's eyes immediately shifted to see who it was. Thankfully, Mom jumped right in to help their newest customer, leaving Abby to her own thoughts. What if this ridiculous cruise was their one chance to change the course of their relationship? What if something shifted while they were on the ship, and she got the second chance she was hoping for? That could happen, right? But what if pretending she and Tom were a happy couple only made things worse? What if it only proved their issues were too big to overcome? That last thought plagued Abby for the rest of the day. Chapter 2. Thomas Sinclair went back and forth between relief that Abby agreed to go on the cruise and worry that the whole thing would blow up in his face. After all, the break he'd thought might last a few days or a week had stretched into nearly a month. Either way, being trapped on the cruise together might force them to work things out, because they clearly weren't doing that on their own. He didn't regret asking her to meet him. He missed his wife terribly, and without any mutual friends, there wasn't anyone to tell him how she was doing. He did, however, wish their lunch hadn't been quite so businesslike, and that work hadn't interrupted their conversation. Tom wondered all day what Abby had planned to say before the call came through from dispatch. By the time he finished both the extra shift and his regular shift, Tom was exhausted. It was nearly 4 a.m. when he drove up to his youngest brother's place. The lights were still on. Tom had forgotten this was Will's first of 3 days off from the fire department. He found his brother lounging on the couch, a wireless gaming controller in his hands, and an open bag of chips on the cushion next to him. Hey, he wiped potato chip dust on his pants leg and gave him a one-handed wave. How was your day? Pretty typical. He nodded toward the TV. I see you're starting your 3 off in style. Will grinned. Yep, care to join me? He grabbed a second controller off the coffee table and tossed it to Tom. Tom flopped onto the couch and propped his feet up. Playing a racing game was exactly what he needed. They'd only been racing for 15 minutes or so when Tom said, I went to see Abby before my shift. So much for the game keeping his mind off of her. Will was the only family member who knew that he and Abby were taking some time apart. True to his word, his brother had kept his promise not to tell anyone else, even if he'd made it clear he didn't agree with Tom's choices. Will hazarded a glance at Tom, which caused his virtual car to veer off course. It's about time. How'd it go? I asked if she'd consider going on the cruise, so I don't have to come clean with Grandma and Grandpa just yet. He nodded when Will gave him an exasperated look. Yeah, I know. Tom let his head fall back against the back of the couch. Seriously, God, how is it I can handle everything my job throws at me but act like an idiot around my own wife? A snort had Tom raising his head again, only to find Will desperately trying to stifle a laugh and failing miserably. Nice you can find humor at my expense. Your expense? Will coughed, a grin still firmly plastered on his face. Dude, you've shot yourself in the foot with that move. You never should have moved in here in the first place. Not that I mind having you around. I've never even been close to falling in love or getting married. And even I could tell you asking her to go on the cruise without telling her how you feel is no way to win the girl back. What are you expecting her to do? Just act like everything is fine and then go back to living in separate houses when we get home? He gave a dramatic shake of his head. Will wasn't wrong. Tom originally thought leaving for a few days would be exactly what Abby wanted and needed to give them both some time to think. That kiss goodbye was never supposed to be permanent. He'd relive that moment over and over, mentally kicking himself each time. Afterward, it had killed him to not have contact with her, although it was as much his fault as it was hers. Neither wanted to be the first to admit they'd been wrong. He stood by what he'd said about her mother, though. Meredith constantly spewed negativity in general and targeted their marriage specifically. When Abby made comments about his job or their relationship, he wondered whether they were Abby's own thoughts or a result of Meredith's consistent influence. Tom's parents had welcomed Abby into the family as if she were one of their own. Too bad Abby's hadn't done the same for him. He'd hoped that would change once they were married. If anything, her parents' treatment of him had only gotten worse. What hurt the most was that Abby rarely corrected or stood up to them, no matter who they criticized. He could handle their constant complaints, but he worried about his wife. She desperately needed some distance between herself and her family, her mother in particular. She shouldn't have to hear her parents point out all her flaws every chance they got. Instead of considering a job change, she'd kept working for her mother, and he continued to see her struggle with her own sense of self-worth. It irked him to no end. What really bothered him was not knowing whether Abby really felt like they needed this break, or if the mess of a family she came from was leading her straight into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And where did he fit in with everything? Right now, all he knew was that he still cared about her, loved her. Looking into those gorgeous green eyes of hers today only further hammered that fact home. That's why he'd regret if he didn't do everything in his power to win her back. Going on this cruise with Abby could be the first step. It would force them to spend time together, to talk. He prayed it would give him the opportunity to fix this mess. And if he failed, at least it wouldn't be for lack of trying. It was Wednesday evening, and Abby had considered skipping her usual Bible study meeting. It had been nearly impossible to focus on anything important over the last day or two, and she wasn't convinced that Bible study would be any different. But then she'd gotten a text from one of her best friends, Mandy Hudson, who asked if Abby was going to be there. When Abby responded that she wasn't sure, she got another text from her other friend, Raven Weber, encouraging her to go. How could she say no when the two were clearly collaborating? Besides, in the past, getting together with her friends and others from church had helped her through some difficult times with her parents. Going on this cruise with Tom and his family wasn't going to be easy. It wouldn't hurt to let her friends know what was going on and ask for extra prayer over the situation. By the time their meeting wrapped up, she was so glad she'd gone. When Abby asked if they had a few minutes afterward to talk about Tom, Mandy and Raven insisted that ice cream was in order. 15 minutes later, they each sat perched on tall stools around an even taller circular table. Raven, who loved chocolate, had chosen a scoop of chocolate fudge topped with chocolate chips. Mandy was the opposite and had chosen a rainbow sherbet. Abby's ice cream was vanilla with maraschino cherries mixed in it, along with ribbons of chocolate and little pieces of chocolate brownie. It was the perfect combination. The girls had been right. This was exactly what she needed. They enjoyed their ice cream in comfortable silence for a minute or two before Mandy pointed her spoon at Abby. "You wanted to talk about Tom. What's going on?" Her brown eyes held a mixture of concern and understanding. Raven said nothing, but she'd placed her own spoon in the cardboard bowl and had given Abby her full attention. Abby allowed herself another large bite of ice cream before telling her friends everything about her mother, insisting she ask Tom for a divorce, the cruise, and her own doubts and fears. Seriously, what am I supposed to do? I didn't feel like I could say no to the cruise. They'd already purchased our tickets. And I would hate to upset them right before their anniversary celebration by telling them we'd separated. Tom should have told them weeks ago. She couldn't keep the accusatory tone from her voice. Yes, he should have, Raven agreed with a stern nod. You shouldn't have been put into this position in the first place. But now that you're here, maybe the cruise will be the chance you need to talk to Tom. I mean, you two have been avoiding each other for far too long. Leave it to Raven to shoot straight. Then again, that was one of the many reasons why Abby valued her thoughts so much. Mandy nodded. I agree. I don't see any way around the cruise either. But you and Tom will be in a somewhat confined space a lot of the time. It'd be good if you could talk long enough to get things settled, one way or another. Abby knew they were right, but it wasn't that easy. What if his family can tell things are different between us? What if we end up ruining the trip anyway? First of all, Raven began with a kind smile, you wouldn't ruin the trip. Make things a little awkward maybe, but if they're even remotely like my family, there'll be drama of one kind or another anyway. There's no way you get that many family members in one place with no way to escape and not have drama. That made Abby laugh. You're probably right. Mandy reached over and laid her hand on top of Abby's. What do you want? Maybe Tom and I didn't start off this marriage on the best footing, but I know I don't want a divorce. A shiver ran through her, and Abby wasn't sure if it was from the ice cream or the topic of conversation. I don't want to be like my parents, you know? Raven gave a satisfied nod. Then we pray for protection over the relationship that you and Tom do have, for the opportunity to really talk to Tom before you guys get back to Clearwater, and for wisdom. Tears pricked Abby's eyes. She reached for her friend's hands as Mandy began to pray aloud. Chapter 3. Abby had a number of things on her bucket list that she wanted to do or see, but a cruise had never been one of them. The very idea of being stuck on a boat out in the middle of the ocean with no real way to escape had never appealed to her. The day already felt a million hours long. She and Tom had flown on a crowded plane to Port Canaveral in Florida early that morning. Once they'd reached the cruise ship terminal, it took forever to board. Now they all stood at the railing and waved to the crowd on the dock below as the large vessel began to move. Thanks to the family members crowded around them, Abby found herself pressed against Tom's side. She tried, less than successfully, to ignore the warmth of his skin that easily penetrated the light blouse she'd chosen to wear. 2 months ago, he would have had his arms around her. She would have leaned into his strong chest and relished the opportunity to spend time with him away from everything else. Now, Abby's brain swirled with the many unknowns ahead of them. Could they act normally and convince Tom's family there was nothing wrong with their relationship? She glanced over her shoulder at Grandpa and Grandma Sinclair. They were holding hands and smiling from ear to ear. Not only was this their anniversary celebration, but they'd paid for everyone's ticket. They deserved to have an amazing trip, and Abby wasn't about to be the one to spoil it for them. So when Grandma met her eyes and gave a little wave, Abby offered a genuine smile and waved back. She could handle 5 days and 4 nights with Tom. Abby wished she couldn't see the irony in all this. She and Tom never did have a honeymoon. If it weren't for their separation, they could have considered this a late one. She glanced over and up at Tom to find him watching her with a thoughtful look on his face. Was he thinking the same thing? Please, Lord, Help us to hold it together so we don't ruin things for Tom's grandparents." Tom cleared his throat and motioned to the dispersing crowd. His family had already made plans to meet again for dinner in 2 hours. Without a word, she and Tom walked together and took the elevator down to their room. Tom swiped a card through the reader. When the light turned green, he opened the door and motioned for Abby to go in ahead of him. Their luggage rested along one wall next to a wooden dresser. Across the room from that stood the large king-sized bed. Mints rested on all 4 of the fluffy pillows. Crammed in a space on the other wall was a small couch that looked more like a love seat and not nearly as comfortable as that bed did. Tom immediately tossed his jacket onto it. "I can take the couch." When Abby stared at him, one eyebrow raised, he paused. "What?" She eyed his larger frame. He wasn't basketball player tall, but tall enough to be incredibly uncomfortable sleeping on the tiny couch. It'd be a challenge enough for her to fit on it. "It hardly qualifies as a couch. There's no way you'll be able to sleep there." "I can take it. I sleep on my side anyway." Tom shook his head. "That's not happening." Abby tried to shove down her irritation. Why did he have to take charge of every situation? Was he really being chivalrous? Or just trying to avoid sharing a bed with her at all costs? That last thought made her stomach sour. So much for this turning into the reconciliation tour she'd half hoped it might be. "Don't be stubborn." "Don't push it, Abby. The bed is yours." She'd never sleep knowing he was crammed onto that stupid couch. With a heavy sigh, she picked up a mint before grabbing one of the large pillows and tossing it into the middle of the bed. "Then it's yours too. My side, your side." The bed was so large they could easily stick to their sides and never touch each other. To her surprise, Tom didn't argue. They had 2 hours to kill before dinner. She placed a hand against one wall. "Can you feel the motion of the ship?" Abby wished they had a window in their stateroom so she could look outside. It unnerved her to be able to feel the ship move and not have any visual reference for where she was. Tom stilled for a moment. "Yeah, now that you mention it." When she went to lift her suitcase, he took it from her. "Where do you want it?" She motioned to the bed. He set it down easily and only gave a brief nod when she thanked him. They both started to unpack their suitcases. She placed her clothes in the closet and the built-in dresser. She hadn't known what to expect on the cruise, so she tried to come prepared for anything. Once finished, she took up the paperback she was currently reading and set it on the nightstand, leaving 3 more nestled in the bottom of the suitcase before stowing it against one wall. Tom chuckled. "No wonder that thing was so heavy." He shook his head. "E-books would have been so much easier to bring along." "You know me. I prefer a good paperback." Abby tapped the cover. She brought the book to her nose and inhaled deeply. It was one of her favorite scents. Amusement flashed in his eyes along with something else that disappeared a moment later. He nodded toward the bottle of Dramamine. "Have you taken any yet?" "I'm hoping I won't need to." Even as she said the words, her stomach felt a little queasy. Hopefully, it was just a matter of getting used to being out on the water. Or nerves. Probably a combination of both. Yes, she came prepared just in case. But something told her that there was nothing she could do to steel herself for what it would be like to share this cramped space with the man who inspired such a convoluted mix of emotions. Abby flopped onto the bed and relished the feel of being off her feet. Seriously, she could fall asleep right now and skip dinner entirely. "So, how are we going to pull this off?" Tom stilled. "What do you mean?" "We've only been married for 6 months. Your family will expect us to still act like newlyweds. I'm thinking they'll notice if we spend the whole vacation doing our own things." She'd thought about that a lot since she'd agreed to go on the cruise in the first place. There was no way they'd be able to get away with keeping their distance. His family would figure out something was wrong. "This is your show, Tom. Your family. What do you want to do?" Tom excelled at taking control of a situation, and this was no different. He stood again, his shoulders back. "Holding hands, an occasional kiss, and we'll make sure we attend at least half of the activities together. Does that sound about right?" His words were spoken with little emotion, but a glimmer in his eyes betrayed him. It gave Abby some hope, because maybe it meant that this was just as emotionally confusing for him as it was for her. "Yeah, that sounds good." Her heart squeezed. As much as she hoped this cruise might lead to some kind of resolution, she also needed to keep her feelings in check. Things had been hard enough when they went their separate ways before. She wasn't sure her heart could survive that a second time. It wouldn't be easy, especially if kissing her handsome husband was only supposed to be for show. Chapter 4. Tom placed his hand against Abby's lower back as they found their way through the cruise ship to the large restaurant overlooking the ocean. They'd made arrangements for the whole family to eat their meals in the same area of the formal dining room. Considering that included more than 20 people, it was not a small crowd. A waiter met them at the entrance and escorted them to one of two large tables pushed together. Tom pulled a chair out and waited for Abby to sit before pushing it closer to the table. He took the next seat over and leaned in close to her. "At least the food smells good." She nodded, and the scent of her shampoo, a combination of rosemary and mint, enveloped him. He loved the smell and could have sworn he could still catch whiffs of it even weeks after he'd moved out of their house. The night he went to bed and realized the scent had faded was a particularly difficult one. He forced himself to lean away from her and focus as Grandpa stood and addressed the family. "We can't begin to tell you how much it means to have you all here." He reached for Grandma's hand and tugged her up to stand next to him. "Our 60 years together haven't always been easy. We've been through our share of rough times. But God brought us through it all and saw fit to bless us with a beautiful family. Thank you for being here to help us celebrate." He placed a tender kiss on his wife's lips. "Now, let's give thanks for our meal." Everyone bowed their heads. Grandpa cleared his throat. "Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to spend time together as a family. Thank you for helping us all to get here safely. We ask that you be with us over the next few days and remind us all of what really matters. Bless this food to our bodies and bless the hands that prepared it. Amen." Tom added one more silent line to the prayer. "Please help Abby and me to find our way back together." "Amen," he murmured along with others around the table. Tom studied the menu in front of him. His gaze settled on the steak and baked potato. Finally, an easy decision. It was no surprise that Abby perused the salad page. She loved a good salad. She wasn't a vegetarian, though, and insisted on having a healthy helping of meat on it. She ran a slender finger down the page, reading each salad description, and seemed to pause over the grilled salmon. "So, how do the two of you like your room?" Mom's voice from the other side of the table drew Tom's attention. "Ours is just lovely. Oh, and the balcony." She sighed, her eyes half closed. "I could easily spend half the cruise sitting out there and watching the ocean." She took Dad's hand. "I can't remember the last time we got away like this." They looked at each other, love evident in their eyes. The last thing Tom expected was for Abby to rest her hand in his. He immediately threaded his fingers with hers and gave it a squeeze. He knew it was all for show, but he hadn't realized how much he missed the feel of her small hand nestled in his until now. "Ours is really nice, too," Tom answered with a smile. Abby nodded her agreement. It really is pretty. I can't believe how large this ship is. I'm carrying the map around everywhere so I don't get lost. She glanced at Tom. When I'm not with my human GPS, anyway. The ability to picture a map in his head had come in handy on multiple occasions. Abby was the opposite. She got lost easily if she didn't have directions of some kind. She'd always referred to him as her own personal GPS, admiring his ability to find his location anywhere he went. He kind of liked that she needed him. It was one of the many reasons they were a good match. They still were, and he planned to prove to her why they needed to give their marriage another shot. He ran a thumb across the back of her hand before releasing it when the waiter brought their drinks. As everyone ate their meals, they went over their copies of the ship's itinerary as different family members planned activities together. Tomorrow, they'd spend most of the day on the island of Nassau. To Tom's relief, he and Abby could go to the water park first thing with the rest of the family. They decided to figure it out as they went after that. Tom finished every bite of his meal, determined to order the same thing again before the trip ended. He glanced at Abby's plate and was surprised by how little she had eaten. He leaned close so he could speak without anyone else hearing. "If your salad isn't good, I can have them bring you something else." Abby shook her head. He almost questioned her about it when she pulled a dose of motion sickness medication out of her bag and popped it into her mouth before chasing it down with a drink of water. He immediately felt a wave of sympathy for her. He'd worried about seasickness himself, but so far, it wasn't bothering him. Hopefully, Abby could get some sleep tonight and wake up no longer feeling the effects of it. By the time everyone had finished their late dinner and spent time visiting, it was nearly 11 o'clock. Abby masked yawns multiple times, and Tom wasn't feeling much more alert. The family group finally broke up, agreeing to meet for breakfast the following morning. Abby walked by Tom's side until they reached their stateroom. He unlocked the door and motioned for her to go in ahead of him. Once inside, they switched the lights on. Abby plugged her phone into the charger, kicked her shoes off in a corner, and retrieved clothing from the dresser before disappearing into the bathroom. Tom checked his email and plugged his own phone in. His gaze stalled on the pillow Abby had thrown onto the middle of the big, king-sized bed earlier. He'd had every intention of sleeping on the tiny couch, but had been relieved when Abby insisted that he share the bed. Truthfully, there was no way he could have slept all scrunched up like that, nor was he about to subject her to the same. The bathroom doorknob turned, drawing his attention. He took in the sight of Abby wearing a pair of purple shorts and a matching shirt. His mind immediately went to the first time she wore them to bed. He'd told her she looked adorable. She'd blushed. And then he'd kissed her until they were both breathless. Tom realized he'd been staring when she paused and looked at him questioningly, her cheeks turning pink. Did she remember that night, too? An invisible rope cinched tightly around his heart. Regardless of what happened between them, he couldn't deny she was a beautiful woman, both inside and out. He was blessed to have her in his life, and could only pray that would continue somehow after the cruise was over. Will was right. He'd been crazy to walk away from her at all. Abby pointed to the bathroom. "I'm all done." She covered another yawn. "I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted." "Yeah, me too. Do you feel any better after taking the medicine?" She shrugged. "A little." She swallowed and her skin turned a shade paler. "I just want to get some sleep." "Go ahead and turn the lights off. I'll be out in just a second." She nodded as he scooped up a pair of sleeping shorts and went into the bathroom. When he emerged again, Abby was already in bed, her right arm curled around a pillow while her dark hair fanned over a second one. Tom didn't miss that she'd chosen the same side of the bed as she did at home. The pillow she'd tossed in the middle of the bed was still there. He left it, taking his cue from her. Her eyes were shut, but when he turned the last light off, she spoke from the darkness. "I think things went okay today, don't you?" "Yeah, I do. So far, so good." Tom pulled the covers back and slipped between the sheets. "Tomorrow will be a busy day. It sounds like fun, though." "It does." Abby shifted her weight and pulled the comforter up to cover her shoulders. "Good night, Tom." "Good night, Abby. Sleep well." While her breathing slowed and she seemed to fall asleep nearly immediately, Tom wasn't so lucky. He went over tomorrow's itinerary in his head. He couldn't wait to spend some time with Abby. Suddenly, the familiar smell of mint and rosemary drifted from his wife's side of the bed. He breathed in deeply as the scent relaxed him more than he'd felt in weeks. The last image in his mind was that of his wife lying next to him, looking sleepy and peaceful. Chapter 5. They hadn't even been on the ship for 20 hours, but disembarking and stepping onto dry land again had Abby breathing a sigh of relief. She'd hoped sleeping last night would ease her nausea. And it had, at first. But by the time they got to the dining room for breakfast, her seasickness was in full swing, and she'd actually thrown up twice. So much for enjoying that amazing breakfast buffet she'd read about. Hopefully the island excursion would provide some relief. Last night had been all kinds of confusing. Trying to act like a normal married couple during dinner should have been easy enough since everyone else kept the conversation going. Yet, Abby had found herself second-guessing every move she made, wondering if she'd been right to reach for Tom's hand when she did. After the meal, when they didn't have a reason to sit next to each other, Abby missed the closeness they'd shared at the table. Why did all of this have to be so difficult? Getting back to their room and climbing into the same bed when nothing was remotely the same between them didn't help. Yes, the sweet, warm air of Nassau had an immediate soothing effect on her nerves. She inhaled deeply and took in the clear, blue water licking at the white beach. She couldn't wait to walk barefoot and let the waves wash away her stress. They had 8 hours before they had to return to the cruise ship, and Abby intended to enjoy every minute. There were so many things she wanted to do, and there was no way she could fit it all in. For now, the whole family planned to go to the water park. Abby had looked it up online, but as they entered the park, the giant water slides looked even larger in person. Hopefully Tom would understand if she avoided them, since she didn't find plummeting to the ground on a twisting wet slide the least bit appealing. She'd once told him about how her dad had teased her by pretending to throw her out over the edge of an embankment. Ever since then, she'd disliked heights. Abby jumped when Tom reached over and took her hand in his, weaving their fingers together. He leaned in close. "How about we check out the lazy river?" Did he remember their conversation about her fear of heights? She fought back the tears that threatened in response to his thoughtfulness. She gave his hand a squeeze. "That sounds great." Tom's parents, Eric and Leslie, joined them. "I don't know about you," Leslie said to Abby, "but I could spend the whole day on the lazy river. It's so relaxing." Abby nodded with a smile. "I couldn't agree more." She tilted her head toward one of the largest water slides that towered far above them. "I'm not sure someone could pay me enough to go down that." "Me either," Leslie smiled brightly. Abby liked her mother-in-law the moment they met. She'd always thought Tom was lucky to have grown up with his parents. They talked a little more as they waited in line for their turn to snag an inner tube just across from the lazy river entrance. Eric grabbed a large one, perfect for a couple to share, and handed it to Tom. "Here, you two go." Then he grabbed another for them. He held a hand toward Leslie, and the two of them got settled on their inner tube and floated away. Abby didn't know about Tom, but she'd originally intended to get her own. So much for that plan. When she looked at him, he shrugged as though he didn't really care. He entered the water and held their tube in place while Abby got situated. When she was ready, He jumped and slid onto it beside her. The tube wobbled back and forth as their bodies settled together in the middle opening of the tube. Abby instinctively grabbed his arm, as though that alone would keep them from tipping into the water. As they inched along the river, Tom tried to shift his weight a little so he wasn't squished up against her. She let go of his arm, only to discover there was really nowhere else to put her own. Tom's left leg crossed over Abby's, right at the ankle, and he glanced at her apologetically. She gave him a little nod to let him know it wasn't his fault, and then turned her attention to the ride. Mist rained down on them from above as they floated slowly through the curves and gentle waves of the river. Even though their inner tube often bounced against the side of other tubes, Abby found the whole thing relaxing. At least now that they were on the island, her motion sickness had faded some. They could see platforms and bridges ahead of them. People were using streams of water and buckets to periodically dump water on the lazy river below. Suddenly, they picked up speed, and Abby instantly gripped Tom's arm again. A large bucket of water tipped the moment their inner tube went under the first bridge. Tom leaned over to shield Abby, the water hitting the back of his head and neck. When he lifted his head again, water dripped off his nose and onto Abby's forehead. She giggled. "Your sacrifice is noted." "I hope so," he said with a chuckle. He ran his free hand over his face to get the water out of his eyes. "I can't promise I'll be able to block them all, though." Tom grinned at her, his gaze tangling with hers for several moments before a stream of water hit them both in the face. He barely had enough time to sweep some hair away from her cheek before another spray of water headed their way. Abby laughed more than she had in a long time as they tried to dodge the water either by blocking it or using the sides of the river to push their tube back and forth. Most of the time, they were completely unsuccessful, but that made it all the more fun. By the time they got back to the beginning, they were both soaked. "We may as well go around again," Tom said, a challenge in his eyes. "You game?" "Definitely." They'd finally given up trying to keep any distance between themselves since the motion of the water made it impossible. Abby shifted her weight on the inner tube, and her hand brushed against Tom's. Before she could move it again, he'd captured it with a gentle squeeze. "This time, we'll take the left path at the fork and see if there are fewer buckets of water." She nodded her agreement. Their experiment resulted in them becoming even more soaked by the time they reached the end. This time, Tom grabbed the railing and guided their inner tube into the little docking area by the stairs. He got out first before reaching a hand to her. She grasped it, glad for help as she slid herself off the tube in an entirely unladylike manner. Thankfully, he hadn't let go of her hand yet, because she stumbled on the last step. Tom tightened his hold and pulled her to him before sliding his other arm around her waist. "You okay?" "I'm good. Just hoping no one saw that," Abby chuckled. "Thanks." She breathed in deeply as she forced herself to take a step away from him. It took some effort to focus on his face instead of his broad chest and strong arms that moments earlier felt like heaven. That was fun. The river. But also just doing something together. During the day, even. She'd meant it simply and sincerely. But when Tom's eyes darkened and he dropped her hand, she realized he'd taken it as a dig at their conflicting schedules. She flinched. "I didn't mean it like that." A lump formed in her throat. "I know." Tom motioned to the right. "I think Will is waiting for me to join him at the wave pool. I'll see if I can find him. Would you like to come?" It was an invitation, but his expression and cooler tone implied he was still struggling to let her earlier comment go. Abby shook her head. "I need to go back to my locker, get dried off. Then I think I'll lounge around for a while. I'll find a chair nearby, though." Tom seemed reluctant, but when she turned toward the lockers, he headed in the opposite direction. Abby could have kicked herself over her choice of words. Of course he'd take that personally, since she'd bothered him about their schedules more times than she could count. Why was thinking before speaking such a challenge for her? Ugh. Trying not to feel down about it all, she retrieved her book, purchased a bottle of water, and grabbed a fresh towel from a nearby stack. After that, she found a beach chair near the wave pool. It didn't take long to spot Tom visiting with Will as they rode the waves up and down. Lounging by the pool while reading a good book was her idea of a perfect way to spend some time. She must have fallen asleep, because the next thing she knew, Tom sat on the edge of her lounge chair with a concerned look on his face. "Abby?" She tried to shake some of the fog from her head and sat up straighter. "I guess I was more tired than I realized," she yawned. "How long was I out?" "I'm not sure. At least 20 minutes. I figured I'd better check on you." He frowned. "Are you feeling okay?" "Yeah, I think so." Her stomach growled. Maybe some food was in order since she hadn't eaten much that morning. I think I'll go get something from the snack bar and see if that helps." Tom leapt to his feet. "What do you want? I'll get it for you." Maybe some pretzels. Or a piece of fruit, if they have it. I'll see what I can find." Abby wanted to insist she could get it herself, but Tom was off on his mission before she got a chance to stand up. When he returned, he had a banana as well as 2 large, soft pretzels in his hands. The moment she took a bite of the pretzel, she closed her eyes and nodded slowly. "Yep, perfect. That's what I get for having to skip breakfast and upchucking what little I had eaten." Tom's eyes narrowed. "You got sick? Man, I hoped the medication would take care of that. There's a doctor on the ship. Maybe it would be worth stopping by the infirmary to see if they have anything stronger. We'll be at sea all day tomorrow, and I'm sure this is something they have to address all the time." Just the thought of being on the ship all day was nearly enough for Abby to lose her appetite now. Yeah, don't remind me. Maybe seeing the doctor wasn't a bad idea. "I'll stop by when we get back." That seemed to satisfy him. He relaxed on a chair next to hers and wolfed his pretzel down. "We need to figure out where we're going to go after this. There are all kinds of things to do on this island. So how about I pick one thing and you pick one, and we'll do those together. Keep up the front and all. Then we can be on our own this evening if we want to." Abby liked that idea. If doing activities together was awkward, then at least there would be some quiet reading time to look forward to later. "Yeah, sure." She didn't have to think long about her choice. "How do you feel about swimming with the stingrays?" He smiled. "Sounds great. And how do you feel about a long walk along the beach? We may be able to time it during low tide." The choice surprised her. "I figured you'd be more interested in hiking to the falls or sailing on a yacht. Something like that." "I wouldn't dream of dragging you back out on another boat. Honestly, I considered the falls, but it's a long hike, and I'd rather have more time to relax." Abby smiled. "Walking along the beach sounds great." With that decided, Tom looked out at the wave pool where Will motioned for him to go back. "Do you want to join us?" he asked her. Abby had a lot more energy after some food and a nap. The wave pool looked like fun, and Tom seemed almost hopeful. She couldn't turn him down. Besides, Will was there. It would be an easy way to spend some time with Tom without the pressure of real conversation. Chapter 6. Tom enjoyed the water park, but looked forward to spending some one-on-one time with Abby. He hadn't been the least bit surprised when she chose to swim with the rays. It was the first thing she'd commented on when they heard about Grandma and Grandpa's offer to take everyone on the cruise. He remembered Abby saying she wished she could take scuba diving lessons. Maybe, one day, they could go on an excursion, just the 2 of them, and have the opportunity. Halfway through the thought, he stopped himself. All Tom could do was hope that this trip was the start of a new beginning for them, because he didn't want to think about the alternative. For now, He thoroughly enjoyed the pure delight on her face as she reached beneath the surface of the water and allowed her hand to brush against a cow-nosed stingray as it passed by. It wasn't just her, though. Tom had to admit the whole experience was pretty memorable. He owed a lot of that to sharing it with Abby. By the time it was over, she had a permanent smile on her face. "That was incredible!" She clasped her hands together in front of her. "Working somewhere like this would be the perfect job. Seriously, can you imagine being around the rays all the time like those people are?" "It would be a fun job." He studied her. "Though I wonder if the employees live here full-time, or if they do a lot of traveling." She paused in thought. I don't know. I guess work here is probably seasonal," she shrugged. "Even that would be worth it." Tom glanced at his watch and couldn't believe the time. If things continued this way, they might not spend a whole lot of time apart. The thought gave him some satisfaction, especially since Abby hadn't exactly complained. Hopefully, her lack of objection meant she was enjoying herself, too. He pictured his parents and his grandparents and their frequent public displays of affection. A twinge of jealousy surged before he could suppress it. Was it so wrong to want that kind of relationship with his wife that he'd seen in his family? Before the cruise, it felt like there were multiple hurdles in their way, and Tom wasn't sure if they were going to be able to clear them. But here, spending time with Abby made him hopeful. 20 minutes later, they'd changed into casual clothes and met at the pavilion. They purchased a couple of ice cream cones and then set out for the beach. Tom noticed that Abby hadn't bothered to put her sandals back on and smiled. She always preferred to go barefoot if she had a choice. He glanced at her feet and the silver ring hugging her left little toe. She'd worn it for as long as he'd known her. "Have I ever asked you where you got your toe ring?" Abby stopped walking and wiggled her toes in the wet sand. "It's silly." When she realized he truly wanted to know, she continued. "It was the last gift my parents bought me before they split. I was 13 and we'd gone to the mall. They didn't fight over anything that day. We looked in stores, ate lunch at the food court, and got chocolate chip cookies for dessert. You know, like the happy families I used to envy. I saw a display of rings, loved this one, and they bought it for me." She shrugged. "That day may have only been the eye of a storm. But I guess I like to be reminded that there was an occasional lull, you know?" Tom's heart hurt for her. Being a teenager was hard enough without having to deal with the kind of family drama she'd endured. "I think that's a nice story." The warm sun was making quick work of their ice cream. A trail of pink had made its way down her cone and onto her hand. Without thinking, he swiped some away and licked his finger. She licked around the edge of her cone to stop the mini rivers, her eyes on him. When her cheeks turned pink, Tom enjoyed the reaction more than he probably should have. They hurried to finish their treats. Abby ended up throwing the bottom half of her cone away. They walked along the beach and talked about the water park, as well as the rays. The beach was fairly busy, so when they found a shady spot below a palm tree, they sat down on the sand and watched the waves roll in and out. Tom rested one hand on the ground behind him and leaned into it as he lounged. Their shady area was small, and if things were different, he imagined Abby would easily be nestled against his shoulder right now. Instead, she sat close enough for her hair to tickle his arm, yet far enough away to remind him of how messed up their relationship was. "I wish we could spend the rest of the cruise here until it's time to head home," she said, her voice barely audible above the crashing of the waves. "Me too, especially if they kept getting along as well as they were now. Though that goes against the whole idea of a cruise, I suppose." She smiled brightly before looking serious again and wrinkling her nose. "I'm not looking forward to being at sea all day tomorrow." "We can stop by and see the doctor as soon as we get back on the ship." Without looking at him, Abby said, "I'll be sure to do that." Tom didn't miss her meaning. She didn't want, or at least didn't expect, his help. He tried to switch gears in their conversation. "Is the dishwasher giving you any more trouble?" It had quit running for a while until he got it fixed a couple of weeks before they separated. "No, it's working okay." She paused. "I had to buy a new washing machine, though. Ours completely died on me." He blinked at her in surprise. "You could have called me. I would have helped." She shrugged. "They delivered the new one and carted away the other. It all worked out." Her matter-of-fact tone grated on Tom. Not so much because she found a new washing machine and had it delivered, but more because she didn't seem to need him. At least not for the little things that he wanted her to lean on him for, the things he should have been there to help with. Their whole separation suddenly felt a lot more serious than it had even 5 minutes ago. A month had slipped by right under their noses. What else had he missed? It'd be too easy for more time to pass, and watching Abby walk away from him forever didn't sit well with Tom. He wasn't about to let that happen if there was anything he could do about it. It wasn't as easy as all that, though. Especially with her mom constantly telling Abby their marriage would fall apart at any given moment. "How has work been?" The moment he spoke the words, Abby's relaxed demeanor evaporated. She sat up straight and wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling them to her chest. "It's fine. We've been pretty busy. How about you?" She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye before fixing her gaze on the waves in front of them. "Mostly the same. Sergeant plans to have us go to 10-hour days instead of 8, but it would mean 3 days off in a row instead of 2. It seems like a good trade-off." "That'll be nice." She paused. "So, how's it been staying with Will? I imagine there isn't a dull moment." He liked that she was making an effort to continue the conversation. "I've played more video games in the last few weeks than I have in the last 5 years combined," he chuckled. "He's been great about my being there, although I hadn't intended to stay this long." Tom watched her profile, hoping to get a hint of how she felt about the duration of their break. "That's good." She tossed him an odd look. "I admit, there were several times in the last few weeks I've wished we'd gotten a dog. Or a cat." Tom might have thought she were joking, except for the sad tone in her voice. Was it wrong to hope it was because she'd been missing him? He sat up straight and turned to face her. The gentle breeze caught Abby's hair and tossed it around her slightly sunburned shoulder. Using one finger, Tom swept several strands away from her face and tucked them behind her ear, his hand lingering there. "Abby?" He thought to ask her if she'd consider getting back together again, but all he wanted to do was kiss her. Will's voice spoke from behind them, interrupting Tom's chance to do either. His gaze dropped to Abby's lips as regret hit him hard. "There you two are." Will glanced at Tom apologetically and silently mouthed, "I'm sorry." He cleared his throat. "Grandpa got the whole family a reservation at that restaurant on the beach. Apparently it's usually pretty booked, so they're excited. We have less than 40 minutes. I was tasked with finding you to see if you're joining us." Before Tom could answer, Abby scrambled to her feet. "That sounds like a great idea. Thanks, Will." She brushed off her shorts and slung her bag over her shoulder. "I should walk back and clean up a little." Tom stood as well. So much for finishing their conversation, especially when Will fell in step with them. "Did you enjoy the stingray experience?" Will's question was all Abby needed to start gushing about what it was like to feed the rays and feel them swimming past her legs. Tom was glad she had so much fun, and he hoped she'd remember today as fondly as he would. But he also wished they'd had the chance to talk longer. There was way too much left unsaid, and considering the number of family members already gathering, they wouldn't have another opportunity anytime soon. He waited while Abby got her sandals on and made a trip to the restroom. "We spent some good time together, God, and I'm thankful for that. I can't help but feel like this trip is going by way too fast compared to the progress we're making. Please give me patience and the wisdom to know what to do." His silent prayer was cut off when Abby returned. He held a hand toward her. She took it readily. It was probably all for his family's sake, but he would have to be happy with that for now. Chapter 7. Abby wasn't sure she'd ever been this tired in her whole life. Their day on Nassau had been amazing, even better than she'd expected. But good grief, it had been exhausting, both emotionally and physically. Should she be frustrated that Will had interrupted her conversation with Tom on the beach, or thankful? She'd felt that Tom was about to ask her something serious, and she feared he would suggest divorce. Her mom had told her for weeks to expect it. Abby knew she couldn't keep on like this forever, but to finally hammer a nail into the coffin of their marriage, she couldn't do that either. So instead, she'd focused on Will and their conversation as they headed back to town. By the time they all got ready and seated at the restaurant, Abby's stomach had become unsettled again. Sheesh, must be anxiety from knowing they would be back on the ship in an hour or two. As soon as she claimed a chair, she got another dose of motion sickness medication out of her bag and took it with a gulp of water. Tom put a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with concern. "You okay?" She nodded. "Any chance I could just stay here and you all swing by and pick me up on the way home in a couple of days?" It was a complete joke, although, if it were possible, she would be on board, or rather, ashore, 100%. He gently squeezed her shoulder before dropping his hand again. The meal tasted wonderful, but the highlight was the view from the wraparound deck overlooking the ocean. By the time they were done eating, Abby looked forward to getting some rest, even if it was on the cruise ship. To her dismay, it wasn't long after returning to the ship before her stomach started to roll again. She groaned. So much for hoping it'd just disappear. They reached their stateroom, exhausted. "I desperately need to take a shower and wash the beach out of my hair." Abby rummaged through her suitcase. "What are you planning on doing for the rest of the evening?" Tom looked thoughtful. "I figured I'd wait and go with you to see the doctor." Abby shook her head before he'd finished his sentence. "I'd rather go alone." When he started to object, she held a hand up to stop him. "Seriously, I'm just going to take a long shower, stop by the infirmary, and then find a quiet spot to read where I'll stay awake until a decent time before going to bed." She smiled at him in a way she hoped he found reassuring. "You sure?" "I am." She really was, too. She needed some time to herself. "Okay, but if you change your mind, I'll probably be at the poker game my Uncle Peter set up." "Thanks, Tom. Have a good evening, okay?" She carried her stuff into the bathroom and shut the door behind her. When she reemerged 45 minutes later feeling like a new person, he was gone. She ignored the pang of disappointment she had no right to feel, put her bag together, and went in search of the infirmary. Once inside, she didn't have to wait long to be called back. The nurse looked at the paperwork Abby had filled out. "I see here that you can't get your motion sickness under control. What all have you tried?" Abby told her about the medication and how it made her drowsy, which was a problem all on its own. "Is it okay to take this all day while I'm here? Or do you have something else you'd suggest?" She pulled the bottle out of her bag. The nurse raised an eyebrow as she studied Abby closely. "And none of these symptoms started until you boarded the ship? But they continued while you were on shore today?" "Not like this. I've been more tired than usual, but I've been under a lot of stress lately, too." What was the nurse getting at? "Why do you ask?" "Is it possible you're pregnant? When was the last date of your menstrual cycle?" "Pregnant? Yeah, right. There's no possible way." She tried to think back to her last cycle. and her eyes widened. Surely not. I guess it's been about 6 weeks, but I hadn't really noticed. My cycles aren't overly regular anyway, and like I said, the last month or so has been incredibly stressful. The nurse nodded. I understand. Look, I'd like to have you take a test to confirm you're not pregnant before the doctor can prescribe something stronger to combat the seasickness. I have a few other options you might consider as well. Woodenly, Abby agreed and followed the nurse to the bathroom. After receiving instructions, she left a urine sample for the nurse to test and returned to the exam room to wait for the doctor. 20 long minutes later, a man in his 60s returned with a gentle smile. Abby Sinclair, I'm Dr. Clancy. It's nice to meet you. He glanced at her chart. Your test came back positive. Congratulations, you're pregnant. And while you'll need to follow up with your doctor when you get home, based on your last menstrual cycle, you're likely around 6 weeks along, which means I'd rather not prescribe anything major to deal with your motion sickness, since there's a good chance it's at least partially morning sickness. Once that second sentence was uttered, everything else faded into the background. She was pregnant. With a baby. Tom's baby. This changed everything, and Abby couldn't possibly begin to sort through the jumble of thoughts and emotions that bombarded her. Suddenly, her stomach rebelled, and Abby scrambled from the exam table and snatched up the wastebasket, where she promptly lost her dinner. When she'd finished, she looked at Dr. Clancy apologetically. I'm so sorry. Please, don't worry about it. Here, let me take that. The doctor traded her for a circular bag. Why don't you have a seat, and I'll be back. Abby groaned as she got back up on the exam table and laid her head down on the paper-covered pillow on one end. True to his word, the doctor returned minutes later. I take it this is a complete surprise. He patted Abby's arm kindly. You could say that. Abby absently twisted her wedding ring. My husband will get quite a shock. I guess this trip will be memorable in more ways than one. She tried to keep her voice light when she really had no idea how to tell Tom, much less how he would react. What were you saying earlier? She cringed. If you could repeat it all, I'd sure appreciate it. Of course. Abby tried her best to focus as the doctor repeated the information. Thankfully, it was safe to continue taking the medication she already had. But since it's clearly not doing enough for you, you might try some motion sickness wristbands. The doctor went to a drawer and withdrew a small box that he handed to Abby. They don't work for everyone, but I've heard a lot of wonderful reports. I'm more than happy to give them a try. Otherwise, tomorrow's day at sea will be spent hugging the toilet. The doctor showed her how to put them on and where to position them. Maybe it was just wishful thinking, or maybe they really did work. Either way, Abby felt noticeably better by the time she left the infirmary. She had no intention of removing them until she was safely back in Clearwater, and possibly until this kid entered the world. Boy, that was a scary thought. As she exited the infirmary, she threw an exasperated look at the sky. God, if this is your idea of a joke... She had to tell Tom, but now wasn't the right time. Maybe later when they got back to their stateroom. Or tomorrow. What she needed was a quiet place to sit, preferably someplace where no one would find her. But even after she found a spot, she couldn't focus on her book. All she kept thinking about was how her own parents had stayed together for years because of her before finally divorcing. It had been a miserable childhood. What if, once Tom found out about the baby, that was the only reason why he would want to stay married? What if they'd be making the same kind of mistake? Chapter 8. By the time the poker game ended and Tom returned to their room, it was nearly 10 o'clock. He'd expected Abby to be there waiting or asleep. He entered the empty stateroom and mentally kicked himself. He should have insisted on accompanying her to the infirmary. Instead, he'd spent the majority of the game trying to focus on it instead of stressing about his relationship, and failing miserably. When a half hour had passed and Abby still hadn't returned, he set out to find her. 10 minutes later, he neared the pool on the top deck. Since it was dark outside, the lights beneath the water lit it up in an almost ethereal way. There were still quite a few people swimming, so it took Tom a minute to spot Abby. She was alone on the other side of the pool, with her shoes kicked off and a book resting on her lap. She looked completely relaxed. It must have been too dark to read long ago, yet she hadn't put the book away yet. Abby had her head tilted backward, her eyes closed, while her skin fairly glimmered in the moonlight. Man, she was gorgeous. He had the urge to sit beside her and gather her in his arms. It'd be easy to kiss her until they both forgot the reasons they were separated. As though she could sense his presence, Abby's eyes opened and focused on him. "Hey, I take it the poker game finally ended. Who won?" Tom moved another lounger over until it bumped against hers and sat down. "Uncle Peter, by a long shot. I have a feeling we won't hear the end of it for years." He chuckled. Thankfully, Tom hadn't lost much in the game himself. Abby shifted her weight and sat up straighter, her arm brushing his momentarily. The contact sent chill bumps chasing each other across his skin. "What have you been up to this evening?" She shrugged. "I walked around for a while before I came here to read." "In the dark?" She shot him a look that bordered on annoyance. "It wasn't dark when I got here." She sighed. "Sorry, it's been a long day. I guess I was looking for a place where I wouldn't run into any of your family members. I figured no one would really miss me tonight." Tom tapped her arm with his elbow. "I missed you." The words left his lips before he could stop them. Not that he wanted to. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise as she angled her body to make it easier to look at him. We spent all day together. As if doing so meant he'd get tired of her. Instead, it had reminded him of how much he enjoyed her company, enjoyed what they could be together. If he were smart, Tom would end the conversation now before he said something to scare her away. He'd just joke that she was right and suggest they call it a night. Except saying nothing before hadn't exactly made their separation easier. "Not just since the island. I've missed you this last month." Her eyes dilated as she studied him before dropping her gaze with a sigh. "Don't." "Don't what? Say what I'm thinking?" "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" Abby's voice shook. She sat up straight and seemed to be looking everywhere but at him. Late? What did she mean by that? Hadn't she missed him at all? The flip-flop of his stomach mirrored the movement of the water as he thought about that possibility. He continued to watch her profile. Abby reached up and twirled a section of her hair around one finger, a sure sign she was uncomfortable or nervous. He needed to change the topic before she withdrew further. "How did your appointment go? Did the doctor have any suggestions?" "He gave me these." She held up her arms to show him what looked like narrow sweatbands on her wrists. They seemed to be helping quite a bit. "That's great, Abby. I was worried you would be seasick the rest of the trip." She squeezed her upper arm with the opposite hand and took in a slow breath. "Tom." She finally looked at him, her eyes swimming with a vulnerability he'd never seen in her before. "I'm not seasick. I'm pregnant." Pregnant. He blinked at her as that word sank in. "Did you know before tonight?" She shook her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "No idea. I've been tired and feeling run down, but I guess the combination of motion on the ship plus the pregnancy kicked my morning sickness into gear. Lucky me, huh?" "Are you okay?" Did the doctor say anything else? That I'm probably around 6 weeks along, but my doctor back home will have to do an ultrasound to find out for sure. Abby gave a little shrug. I guess it's safe to take the motion sickness pills I have, but I'd rather not if these bands will keep working enough to keep me from feeling miserable. An intense need to protect her and the baby flooded him, and when the single tear escaped the corner of her eye, it cut him to the core. He reached for her then, drawing her to his chest in a gentle embrace. She pushed against him for a moment before allowing herself to be held. He breathed in her scent and relished the feel of her in his arms. We'll figure this out, Abby. She sniffed, her face buried in his chest. Tom couldn't take it anymore. He leaned back and gently lifted her chin until she looked at him. In that moment, the air stilled and every other sound around them faded away. He cupped her face in his hands as her eyes dipped to his mouth. When her lips parted slightly, Tom was no more in control of his actions than he was of the tide or the moon. He leaned in and covered her mouth with his, caressing her hesitant lips until they softened against his. As though he'd found an oasis in the desert, Tom gathered her close and deepened the kiss. He kissed her as though it could somehow erase every moment of worry and doubt he'd had over the last month. He prayed she sensed how much he still loved her. And then, Abby suddenly stiffened and pulled away, the motion dousing his hope as surely as ice water would have. She put one knuckle up to her mouth and bit down on it, her cheeks flushed. Tom, I can't do this. She scrambled to stand and nearly tripped as she shoved her feet into her sandals. Tom stood too and watched as she pushed her book into her bag and gathered her things together. Abby, wait, please. He refused to regret kissing her. He'd made a lot of mistakes over the last month or two, but this wasn't one of them. He just wished she would stop for a minute so they could talk about it. Instead, she slung her bag over her shoulder and took one last long look at him. We can't let this baby be the only reason we get back together. My parents did that when I was a kid, and it was a nightmare. I won't put ours through the same thing. The last word ended in a sob as she sought her escape in the direction of the elevator. And Tom let her. He had no doubt she was heading to their stateroom. She needed some space, and he could give her that, for now. If only he'd told her how he felt earlier today. Then she wouldn't doubt that he wanted to go home again because he was in love with her, not just because of the baby. Why had he waited so long? Chapter 9. Abby had promised herself she wouldn't cry when she talked to Tom. But then he'd been so sweet. And that kiss, man, it had her toes curling and heart racing. For a brief moment, she'd allowed herself to wish for more, for a relationship like the ones his parents and grandparents had. Except she and her husband had been dealt a whole different hand. Abby grew up with parents who hated each other. Sometimes the fighting got so bad that she'd huddle in bed, her pillow pressed against her ears, and wish they would just get a divorce already. When they did, things were quieter. But she never did stop hearing from each parent about the failings of the other. She didn't want that for their child, and if Tom felt like they needed to stay together for the baby, he was wrong. As soon as she got back to their stateroom, she washed her face, changed into pajamas, and crawled into bed. Thankfully, Tom took his time coming back. The last thing she wanted to do was continue their conversation right now. Not when exhaustion and a broken heart warred for top billing. She curled on her side of the bed, covers pulled up to her chin, and tried not to relive that mind-blowing kiss at the pool. A kiss that reminded her of all the others they'd shared. A wave of loneliness penetrated her heart as a stubborn tear escaped her eye and traveled to drip off her nose. If they were a normal married couple, they would have made out at the pool, come back to the stateroom together, and spent the night in each other's arms. Oh, how she missed waking up next to him in the morning. She sniffed just as the door beeped and opened. With a small sigh, she closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep, because she truly couldn't deal with this. Not tonight. She listened as the door closed again and the lock flipped into position. Muffled sounds of footsteps drew closer and stopped by the bed. Abby resisted the urge to peek and see where he stood. Whatever Tom was doing, he seemed to pause near the bed before moving away. Tears built again and stung her eyes and nose. She resisted the urge to sniff because then Tom might know she wasn't really asleep. Instead, she listened as he readied for bed. The mattress moved slightly as he got settled. Abby wished he'd take that stupid pillow out of the middle of the bed, even if all it meant was one less barrier between them. But minutes stretched on until Tom's even breathing told her he'd fallen asleep. Only then did she let the tears fall until her body had no choice but to welcome the numbness of sleep, one arm cradling her abdomen and the innocent life nestled there. It took several moments for Abby to remember where she was when she woke up the next morning. With no window, she couldn't tell what time it was until she rolled over and looked at the clock on the side table next to the bed. It was just after 5. A yawn forced its way out as she tried to blink eyes that were heavy from both lack of sleep and crying the night before. She stilled and listened to the barely perceptible sound of Tom breathing deeply from the other side of the bed. Abby's body begged her to go back to sleep, but her brain was wide awake. She already dreaded talking to Tom when he woke up, especially here in their stateroom, where there was no way to avoid each other. She needed time to think. Fully aware that she was being a coward and running away from the situation, and that it was only a temporary solution, she found clothes by feel and changed in the bathroom. Back at the bed, she tucked a book in her bag, grabbed a jacket, and paused. Tom would be worried if she wasn't there when he woke up. She jotted, "I'll see you at breakfast," on a notepad, left it on his side table, and quietly exited the stateroom. Abby went to the top deck to look out over the ocean. Stars twinkled in the cloudless sky overhead. She breathed in deeply. She could do this. She could get through the rest of this cruise and then figure out where to go from here once they got back to Clearwater, where real life was front and center, and she wouldn't be tempted to pretend things could be okay with Tom. Underlying waves of nausea served as a constant reminder of the pregnancy. Thankfully, the band seemed to keep it somewhat under control. When it was time to meet the whole family for breakfast, Abby was more than ready to eat. Her stomach growled as she entered the dining room. As though drawn to him by some kind of magnetic force, her gaze immediately tangled with Tom's. His eyes narrowed as he crossed the room toward her. He drew near, and Abby's breath caught at the intense look on his face. Unseen energy seemed to crackle between them, culminating in a jolt of electricity when he cupped her elbow with his warm hand. "We need to talk." His words came out in a whisper near her ear. Abby fought to ignore the goosebumps that followed. "They're expecting us to join them for breakfast." "Afterward, then." She patted her back pocket and the printed itinerary she kept there. Originally, she'd agreed to join some of the women on a number of activities that didn't involve Tom. She thought it was a good idea at first, but now she wasn't so sure. "I'm supposed to be getting a mani and pedi with your mom and grandma right after breakfast. They tried to convince me to go for the whole spa treatment thing, but I thought that might be a bit much." His lips brushed the tender skin near her ear, sending tendrils of electricity in every direction. "Then we'll have lunch later, just the two of us. Don't shut me out, Abby." She nodded briefly, and he moved away from her again. "We'd better go find a table." As Abby followed him through the crowd, she tried to ignore his protective hand pressed against her back and the way his arm lingered on the back of her chair after they were seated. He wasn't wrong. She was trying to shut him out because she wasn't ready to face a conversation that would ultimately lead them to getting a divorce. Yet, because of this baby, they would be forever tied together. Oh, she could imagine what her mom would have to say about that when she found out. At least here at the table, any awkwardness between them faded as family joked and conversed around them. Abby happily focused on her breakfast. The pancakes topped with blueberries and crisp bacon would make breakfasts at home pale in comparison. Too bad there wasn't an economical equivalent to cruise food in Clearwater. Abby? She nearly dropped her fork at the mention of her name and looked up to find Grandma watching her expectantly. Abby's cheeks warmed. I'm sorry. I guess I'm too focused on my breakfast. She picked up a slice of bacon. I wish I could get food like this back in Clearwater. Grandma laughed. It is wonderful, isn't it? I asked if you and my grandson had any trips planned for later this summer. Oh. She glanced at Tom, who was busy visiting with Will. She doubted a trip to court would count. We haven't planned anything. Grandma nodded understandingly. We've had many years where our vacations were staycations. It saves a lot of money. She smiled kindly. If you could go anywhere in the world for a future wedding anniversary, and money was no object, where would it be? Abby tried not to look over at Tom, although she could feel his gaze on her as he waited for her reply. In fact, even though it wasn't quite true, it felt like the whole table was waiting to hear what she had to say. Her mind raced to come up with an appropriate response, but all she could think about was the getaway she'd dreamed of all her life. She ignored Tom and spoke from her heart. I want to visit Australia, go on a wildlife tour in the outback. But mostly, I'd love to go snorkeling along the Great Barrier Reef. She used to daydream about seeing sharks and rays as a child. It remained high on her bucket list, especially now that the Great Barrier Reef was endangered. Grandma seemed to approve of her choice. Just as quickly as Abby had become a focus of conversation, it shifted again as others around the table began describing their most elaborate or exotic vacation destinations. Abby glanced at Tom to find him watching her, his expression softening. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite label, and she wondered what he was thinking. If their marriage lasted, where would he want to go? The thought that she might never know hit her hard, and she swallowed the sadness. She focused on her breakfast again in hopes that Tom wouldn't see the change in her mood. 3 more days. Just 3 more days, and she could go back home and try to figure out what normal was. Normal without Tom. Normal with a baby on the way. Did normal even exist anymore? A sudden need to cry hit her, and she did her best to follow the conversation around her while avoiding eye contact with Tom again. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to contain the tears. Chapter 10. As amazing as Nassau had been yesterday, Tom found today on the open sea inversely frustrating. Their only times together happened to be in the company of the rest of the family, which meant trying to find time to talk to his own wife was nearly impossible. At least he'd gotten a few updates. Knowing that his mom and aunt had convinced Abby to go for the full spa treatment after all, implied she was being pampered and given a chance to relax, something she not only needed, but deserved. Now, if only he could try and do the same. Later in the afternoon, Tom was supposed to join Will and some of the others at the comedy club. Tom wasn't the least bit in the mood. He pulled Will aside. Any chance you'd prefer to go shoot some hoops? Will grinned. Are you kidding? He jabbed a thumb in the direction of the comedy club. This is totally not my scene. Tom grinned in return, and the two of them headed for the courts where they played one-on-one. It didn't take long for Tom to work up a sweat. Will ran an arm across his forehead. Man, bro, you've got some serious issues you're working out. What's up? Things not going well with Abby? He smiled again. It looked like you two were making progress when I ran into you at the beach yesterday. Were being the operative word there. Tom jumped at the three-point line and narrowly missed the net. "Things are complicated." Will caught the ball and easily made the rebound shot. "When are they not?" Tom considered not telling Will about the baby, but then his brother was one of his best friends. Since he knew about the separation, and since Tom needed someone to talk to, he decided to make an exception. He grabbed his brother's arm and dragged him to the side of the court away from anyone who might walk by and overhear the conversation. As he told Will about the pregnancy, his brother stared at him in amazement. "Wow, man. What are you guys gonna do?" "I don't know. I found out late last night. Abby left the room early this morning, and we haven't seen each other since breakfast." Tom jabbed his fingers through his hair. "Abby and I are stuck on a boat together. It shouldn't be this hard to find time to talk to my wife." "I get it." Will dribbled the ball and then passed it to his brother. Tom told him about how he'd wanted to go home again and had planned to tell Abby yesterday. But now she would think he wanted to get back together strictly because of the baby. "She's told me the nightmare stories about her parents and being a child of a severely dysfunctional family. She'll do anything to avoid putting our baby in that kind of situation, even if it means leaving me. Because to her, anything is better than raising a child in a marital war zone." His brother listened quietly, something Tom appreciated a great deal. "I just wish I could convince her that I won't let that happen, that we can be different. I wish I'd spoken up yesterday. If I'd listened to my gut." Tom shook his head in frustration. He never should have second-guessed himself. "Well, you're past that now, so you'll need to go forward from here." He clutched the ball with both hands. "Sometimes you can't simply fix a problem. Sometimes you have to figure a way around it, or let it go completely and start all over again." Will caught the basketball. "What do you want to do?" That was easy. He wanted to court her, kiss her, do his best to convince her they belonged together. He said as much. Will nodded approvingly. "Then nothing has to change. Yes, the baby complicates things, but this cruise means you two can't keep running away from each other, at least not for a couple more days. When will you have another opportunity like this?" He winked. "Don't worry. Next time I see Abby, I'll be sure to put in a good word for you." Tom chuckled. "You do that." He sobered. "Do me a favor. Will you pray for us?" Will clapped Tom on the shoulder. "I've been doing that for weeks, bro. I appreciate it." Tom needed to keep his focus, follow the plan, and pray. Pray that if he and Abby were meant to mend things between them, Tom would know what to do and say. "You look all clean and relaxed." Tom bent down and placed a kiss on Abby's cheek, earning him a look of surprise that shifted to mock offense. "Clean? Thanks, I think." She raised an eyebrow at him. They'd agreed to meet and go through the buffet for lunch, and she'd beaten him there. By quite some time, if the open paperback told him anything. Speaking of which, she closed it and put it back in her bag. "I have to admit, the spa wasn't half bad. I always swore I'd never go to one. It seems frivolous, but—" Her voice trailed off. "But you stand corrected." He smiled at her, amused. She seemed happy, carefree. He liked this look on her. Abby scooted her chair out and shifted so she could lift her feet. She held her hands out at the same time and wiggled her fingers. "Check out my nails. Fun, right?" Painted nails weren't his thing, but he had to admit they looked cool. One nail on each hand had been painted to look like waves on the ocean. "They look great, Abby." He slid into the other chair at the little table she'd chosen. "I'm glad you had fun. Mom and Grandma are big on spa days to celebrate every little thing. Birthdays, Mother's Day, Saturdays." He smiled at her laughter.
What I'm trying to say is, if you enjoyed it, you'll likely have a standing invitation.
Her smile fell, and Tom hated that his reference to the future had stolen some of her happiness. He nudged her arm with his.
Come on, enough of that. I've heard the lunch buffet is amazing, and you look like a girl who's worked up an appetite.
His comments managed to tug her smile back into place again.
That's better.
He lifted her hand and placed a kiss on her knuckles. She kept looking at him as though she were trying to figure him out. Tom was happy to let her wonder. He intended to demonstrate just how much he cared, like he tried to do yesterday, and like he should have been doing every day for the last month. They had no problem filling their plates with the wide variety of food before finding someplace to sit. Tom dove right in, happy to see Abby was doing the same. He nodded with satisfaction.
I'm glad you've got more of an appetite today.
She held up her arm and showed off the armband. I wish I'd invented these things. I mean, I'm still not feeling amazing, but at least I'm not puking over the side of the ship. She blushed. Sorry. Good thing you don't have a sensitive stomach, huh? With a chuckle, Tom nodded. He'd seen a lot as a cop. A little talk about vomit didn't faze him. He took a bite of macaroni and cheese.
What are your plans after lunch?
She hesitated. I thought I'd go to the craft thing. I think we're making bracelets or keychains. It might be fun. Tom wiped his hands off on a napkin.
I do believe I'll join you.
Why? The question was genuine, and the shock looked on her face had him chuckling.
Because I'd really like to spend some time together. Try not to read too much into it, huh?
Yeah. He realized he'd flashed her that half smile she once told him drove her crazy. She tried to keep a straight face, but it didn't last long. I'd pay good money to see you making jewelry.
Keep your money. You can use it to buy us ice cream later.
Chapter 11.
What do you think?
Abby looked up from the bracelet she was working on to admire the one Tom held in front of her. Wow, that's really pretty. The blue and silver beads were a striking combination. Maybe you found your new hobby. Tom chuckled.
Never gonna happen. But you really like it?
I do. She looked down at her project. She'd promised to bring Mom a souvenir, and this seemed like the perfect option. While she was happy with her own creation, she seriously thought Tom might have missed his jewelry-making calling. Tom pointed to her bracelet and the flip-flop and lipstick charms.
I'm surprised by your choices, since you don't wear makeup and prefer not to wear shoes unless absolutely necessary.
He gave her an amused smile. Abby laughed. He was absolutely right about that. I'm making this for my mom. The moment she said it, she was afraid it would upset Tom. Thankfully, he didn't appear bothered. You should see her flip-flop collection. I didn't even know that was a thing. Anyway, I promised I'd bring her something.
Thank you.
For what? She watched his serious face with curiosity.
For not having a flip-flop collection.
He smiled then and tapped the tip of her nose with one finger. She shook her head. I probably make up for it with my collection of t-shirts.
Maybe, but t-shirts are way cooler than flip-flops.
Tom gave her a mock, serious look. When they finished the class, he reached for her hand as they left.
Where to now?
He asked her. Honestly? Abby yawned. I'd really like to get a nap before dinner. I'm so tired I can hardly function.
Okay, then let's go take a nap.
He tugged on her hand and led her in the opposite direction. Oh, you don't have to come. I'm sure there's something you could go do with your family. Tom shook his head.
I didn't sleep particularly well last night. I could use a nap too.
When they got to their stateroom and discarded their things, Abby wasted no time collapsing onto the comfortable mattress. She curled up on her side, one arm wrapped around a spare pillow. The bed shifted as Tom laid down, and Abby couldn't stop a little smile from tugging at the corners of her mouth. She'd slept alone for more than a month. Knowing that he was an arm's length away now made her feel safe. It took next to no time for her to drift off to sleep. Sometime later, when consciousness slowly pushed the sleep fog away, Abby's eyes fluttered open. She found herself still lying on her side with Tom's arms wrapped loosely around her. Since they were both in the middle of the bed, there was no way of knowing who initiated the cuddle. Either way, emotions warred with each other. Part of her wanted to stay right there forever. She'd missed the comfort and warmth of his arms. Lying here with him like this gave the illusion that their lives were a lot less complicated than they really were. Maybe it was accidental, but she didn't miss how one of his hands was splayed across her still flat abdomen. She tried to picture a tiny baby nestled in there. It would be easy to pretend they were happily married, that they had planned this pregnancy, that everything about their immediate future was certain, stable. Except it wasn't. This was all an illusion that would shatter the moment they stepped off the boat and back on land. And the less she allowed her heart to open up again now, the less painful it would be then. Right? She rolled away from him. The cool air that enveloped her only accentuated the loneliness in its wake. She bit her bottom lip to keep the tears from forming.
Are you okay?
His voice caught her before she disappeared into the bathroom. She put on her best poker face and peeked her head back out. Yeah. She glanced at the clock. It's after 6. We'll be late for dinner. Besides, she really wasn't in the mood to talk right now. Instead, she took her time in the bathroom, brushed her hair, and then steeled herself before stepping out again. When she did, she found Tom ready to go. He glanced up with a smile.
You look really pretty. I think cruises suit you. Maybe we should go on one every year, or at least every major anniversary.
His words hit her hard. Abby's face must have betrayed her confusion and objections because Tom's fell as he stood. With his hands on her shoulders, he leaned down to look into her eyes.
I don't think it's wrong to look at the future differently now. Do you? What if we can make this work? We have the baby now, and he or she could use both parents together.
She shook her head and took a step back. You know what my childhood was like. I won't have this baby growing up in a household where all his or her parents do is fight. A tear slid down her cheek. I won't have our child curled up in bed pretending he or she can't hear the biting words and wondering what's happening next, or spend years being used as some kind of middleman.
We wouldn't do that, Abby.
How do you know that? Just wanting it to be true doesn't mean it is. She sniffed. Look, I can't do this now. We're supposed to meet your family, and if I look like I've been crying... Frustrated, she walked back into the bathroom, held her breath, and washed her face. Too bad she couldn't scrub away more than just the tears. Part of her knew she was being illogical. She wanted to convince herself of that. But a bigger part knew that it was a huge risk even trying to get back together. A risk that, given her family's history, wasn't worth taking. Not now that she had a baby to think of. She didn't even want to think about what her parents would say when she told them about the baby. We told you, and now you'll see how hard we had it when you were born, would top the list. Abby had hoped this cruise might be a second chance for her and Tom. Why would God bring them this far simply for everything to fall apart again? A steadying breath kept the threatening tears at bay. Tomorrow was their last full day on the cruise, and then they would fly back to Clearwater. She could do this. She could pretend in front of his family just a little bit longer. Then she could go home and fall apart all over again. Chapter 12. Tom absolutely hated the way Abby had shut down since their nap. Sure, they were sitting beside each other at dinner like they had been before, but there were no little glances his way or accidental touches. Instead, she remained focused on conversing with others and only picked at her meal. When they finished dinner and the whole family migrated to the deck party and live music, Tom captured her hand in his for the stroll. He squeezed it gently and leaned close to her ear.
I'm worried about you.
Don't be. He barely heard her, but her clipped words hardly made him feel better. He sighed as she pulled her hand free. Up on deck, music filled the air as a DJ expertly managed the song choices. People danced to the music and congregated at tables around the dance floor, while all kinds of twinkling lights lit up the area. It was magical. Especially when he looked up at the sky. Stars lit it up in a way he'd never be able to see in the middle of town, and the half moon shone brightly. He looked around for Abby and found her sitting next to his mom. He tried to take some solace in the fact that at least she hadn't excused herself to their room and was trying to participate. He just wished she was at his side instead.
Trouble in paradise?
Will's words made Tom jump, and he scowled.
Real funny.
Will tipped his head in Abby's direction.
If you don't want people to start wondering, you might consider not staring at her while looking so down.
Tom shoved his brother good-naturedly. But he was right. If Tom was reacting like that, he needed to get things under control. He shook his head.
I thought we were gaining ground. Then I mentioned the future, and she shut down on me.
With a heavy sigh, he motioned to the happy mob around them. And now here we are, and I can't even dance with my own wife.
You're a mess.
When Tom cut him a warning look, Will chuckled.
You somehow convinced the girl to marry you in the first place. Those same two people are still here, you know. Maybe you just need to find them again.
With a sympathetic look, he clapped Tom on the shoulder.
Meanwhile, if you need a dancing partner, not on your life. Good, because it wasn't a serious offer.
Will laughed before shuffling away with a bow and a grin. Tom chuckled with a shake of his head. Maybe Will was right. Maybe Tom needed to focus on what it was about Abby and himself that brought them together in the first place. Logic hadn't worked to convince her to give them another chance. Maybe he needed to try a different tactic. Most of the music was upbeat. As the evening got later and the crowd dwindled down, the DJ switched things up and started to play slower music fitting for a more intimate setting. Finally, the announcement Tom waited for came over the loudspeaker. All right, all you lovebirds, grab that special someone and get out on the dance floor. That was all Tom needed. He approached Abby where she visited with Grandma at the same time that Grandpa arrived. His grandparents said goodnight and left arm in arm with sweet smiles on their faces. Tom held a hand toward Abby.
May I have the honor of this dance?
He knew she probably didn't feel like she could say no with his family around, but he was still happy when she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her to the dance floor. Tom put one arm around her waist and continued to hold her hand in his as he swept her into the crowd gathered under the stars. When the song morphed into another, he welcomed the feel of her arms around his neck. Everything about this felt right. Tom leaned in and placed a light kiss on her cheek, followed by another one on the corner of her mouth. Abby sighed, her arms tightening slightly around his neck, and Tom kissed her lips softly, briefly, before pulling her close. There, in the crowd in the semi-dark, he prayed fervently for his wife, that she could feel the love he had for her, the hope he had for their future, his support no matter what happened. When the song ended and Abby raised her chin, there were tears in her eyes. Tom wasn't sure what they meant, but he didn't pressure her. Instead, he placed a kiss to her temple before stepping back. She gave him a long, sad look, one that had his heart stalling. Her lips parted as though she were about to say something when the crowd around them shifted and Tom's dad appeared at his elbow. Dad gave Abby a little side hug.
Sorry to interrupt you two lovebirds.
He smiled at her and turned his attention to Tom.
Your grandpa and I are going out on a boat to do some sea fishing tomorrow once we get to the island. Want to join us?
Tom glanced at Abby, hoping she'd interject and say she'd rather they spend the whole day together. To his disappointment, she nodded her agreement. You should go. I bet you guys will have a blast. Just remember, if there's no picture, it didn't happen. She laughed with Dad before disappearing into the crowd. Tom tried to track her progress, but quickly lost sight of her. He didn't want to go fishing tomorrow. He didn't want to leave her side at all. But being pushy hadn't helped, and he doubted shadowing her would win him any points. On the other hand, what if she were giving him an out but secretly wanted him to choose to spend the day with her? He groaned inwardly. If that were the case, she shouldn't have insisted that he go on the fishing trip. It didn't matter which he chose. There was no winning here. Tom turned his attention back to Dad.
Yeah, sure. Fishing tomorrow sounds great.
He'd rather spend the time with Abby. But if she didn't want him around, he'd sure rather stay busy. Dad grabbed an empty chair and motioned for Tom to snag the one next to it.
You two, having fun?
Tom nodded.
It's hard to believe tomorrow is our last full day. It's flown by.
In fact, Tom felt like he was running out of time with real life looming in the distance.
How about you and Mom? It's been great.
He leaned in closer.
I have to admit, I prefer vacations out on the lake, but this is one we'll never forget.
Tom couldn't agree more. The less people, the better. But it was definitely an experience Tom wouldn't have had otherwise, and he was grateful for it. Besides, he had a feeling he and Abby would still be ignoring their issues if they hadn't come on this cruise together. He just had to keep hoping they would make some more progress before this journey came to an end. He didn't realize he'd let his thoughts wander until Dad spoke again.
It's normal for new couples to hit rough patches.
You have no idea. Tom really didn't feel like talking about it. Not here in this crowd where he had to speak loudly just to be heard.
Maybe I should skip fishing tomorrow and spend the day with Abby. Or maybe you both need a little space.
Dad said it as though he were speaking from experience.
Come fishing with your grandpa and me, son. Trust me, it'll clear your head.
Now that he could use. Reluctantly, he finally agreed.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Dad put an arm around his shoulders.
Come on. I've heard there are barbecue chicken skewers. Never say no to barbecue chicken. That would be a true crime.
Tomorrow was his last day with Abby before they went back to Clearwater. Once that happened, their jobs and her family situation would be waiting for them. He needed to make this time count, to connect with her before they had to battle with the challenges of everyday life. No pressure. Chapter 13. Why did everything with Tom have to be so complicated? As if their relationship weren't enough of a mess before this cruise. Now they had a baby to consider. And he'd finally said those words she'd been hoping to hear for the last month. He'd said he wanted to get back together. But how could she know whether it was real or born out of a sense of responsibility for the life they'd created? Waking up in his arms earlier only reminded her of everything she couldn't allow herself to want. Last night, after they got back from the dance party, they'd both claimed their side of the bed with few words exchanged. She didn't know about Tom, but it took a while for her to fall asleep. First thing the next morning, they arrived at the Princess K's Islands. Abby woke early to find Tom still fast asleep. She dressed, got cleaned up as quietly as possible, and left Tom a note letting him know she was going to the buffet. Everyone else talked about getting breakfast on the island, but she'd been nauseous since the moment she woke up and knew she needed something to eat before then. Once she filled her plate with fruit and half a bagel, Abby found a little table to sit at. Not long later, Grandma joined her. "Fancy meeting you here." She brandished her own plate of breakfast food. "I take several medications, and waiting to eat after doing so is never a good idea." She chuckled as she popped a grape in her mouth. "Great minds think alike." Abby grinned at her. Grandma winked. "Since our men are going fishing later this morning, I thought we girls could go shopping. I've heard there are some cute shops we can browse through. What do you say?" Honestly, that sounded a whole lot more fun than sitting around waiting for the guys to get back again. Abby nodded enthusiastically. "Count me in." "Good." Grandma clapped her hands together. "Oh, today will be so much fun." Maybe this was exactly what Abby needed. She couldn't remember the last time she went shopping with her own mother. In the past, it had been a golden opportunity for Mom to criticize Abby's taste in clothing. This had the potential to be a lot more enjoyable. She smiled brightly, excited to have something fun to do to pass the time. "I'm really looking forward to it." "Perfect. Leslie and I will find you once we all disembark." She stood and lifted the rest of her breakfast. "I'd better locate my husband and make sure he's behaving himself." With a soft laugh, she left Abby alone to finish her breakfast. A few minutes later, another shadow fell over the table. Abby looked up to find Tom standing there, a plate in his hands.
"Mind if I join you?"
"Of course not." She motioned to the other chair. "I'm sure there'll be something great on the island, but I couldn't wait that long to eat." He pointed to his plate that mostly consisted of bacon and scrambled eggs.
"Me either. Besides, we haven't taken advantage of this buffet enough, if you ask me."
He smiled at her.
"Hey, are you sure you're okay with the fishing trip?"
She gave him a genuine smile. "Yep. I'll be shopping with your mom and grandma." Tom let out a sharp whistle.
"If you survive a shopping trip with them, it'll prove just how tough you really are."
When she gave him a questionable look, he clarified himself.
"They take their shopping seriously."
"Now I'm scared." Abby laughed. "If we're not back by dinner, send the cavalry." He watched her for several moments before tackling his slightly impressive stack of bacon.
"If you need anything, just call or text. I'll come find you when we get back."
"That sounds good. I hope you have fun fishing." She imagined the chance to have 3 generations of Sinclair men fishing together was not something that happened every day.
"Thanks. I hope you have fun too."
He watched her again, as though he was thinking about saying something else, but chose not to. They finished their breakfast in near silence. Before meeting up with the rest of the family prior to disembarking, Tom surprised Abby by leaning over and pressing a light kiss to her cheek.
"I'm not giving up on us."
He placed something small in her hand, squeezed it gently, and reluctantly walked away from her to where his dad was waiting. She opened her hand and looked at the bracelet he'd made the other day, complete with a stingray charm. Abby gasped as she fingered it. She unfolded a small piece of paper that simply said,
"I don't need an excuse to love you."
Tom wasn't kidding. Grandma and Leslie must have dragged Abby into every store within a 2-mile radius of the docks. By the time they guided her to a little restaurant boasting the best smoothies on the island, Abby's feet were aching. She placed an order and collapsed at a table with a relieved sigh. She tucked her 3 shopping bags on the floor, closer to her chair. At least half of her purchases were bought for her, despite Abby's objections to the contrary. While she had a few moments alone, she admired the bracelet Tom had given her. She'd put it on her wrist as soon as she got to the island and took the motion sickness bands off. It truly was beautiful. Not only were the beads her favorite color, but he'd chosen a stingray charm to remind her of an experience she'd never forget, and one that she'd always associate with him. However, it was the note that she carefully tucked in her back pocket that kept capturing her thoughts. She wanted to talk to him about it, to hear those words from his lips and see the sincerity in his eyes. Her heart skipped a beat just thinking about it. Leslie and Grandma joined her, scooting their own bags under the table and out of the way, and effectively drawing Abby's focus. "Eric will roll his eyes when he sees how much I bought," Leslie said with a chuckle. "Although he knows what kind of a shopper I am, especially when he leaves me without supervision." She winked at Abby. Grandma patted Leslie's hand approvingly. "You could be my biological daughter instead of my daughter-in-law. A girl after my own heart." She pointed at Abby's bags. "And you've got a good start there, young lady. Don't worry, we'll have you learning how to shop till you drop in no time." Abby laughed. "I think today ought to qualify if my feet have anything to say about it." Someone brought their smoothies in 3 coconuts adorned with tiny umbrellas. Abby gratefully accepted hers and took a satisfying sip from the straw. "Oh, man, you can't get anything like this back in Clearwater." "Isn't that the truth?" Grandma tried hers and nodded approvingly. Abby relaxed in her chair as the 3 women enjoyed their smoothies. She watched for several minutes as Grandma and Leslie interacted with each other. They joked and teased, but most of all, they were kind to each other. Wholesome. It was an odd word to come to mind, but it was one Abby couldn't shake. It was also not a word she would associate with her own mother. She tried to imagine sitting at this same table with Mom and failed miserably because she knew the interaction between them wouldn't be nearly as positive. When the conversation lulled, Abby got up the nerve to voice what was on her mind. "What is your secret?" Both women looked confused, so she elaborated. "The 2 of you get along better than I do with my mom. I can't imagine her being kind to a daughter-in-law." She certainly hadn't been kind to her son-in-law. It wasn't easy to admit that out loud, especially when it elicited sympathetic looks in response. Grandma reached over and patted Leslie's hand. "I remember the first time Eric brought Leslie home to meet us. She was shy, and I realized she was as nervous about meeting me as I was her." She smiled. "But when I saw how my son loved her, I knew that Leslie would make a wonderful addition to our family. I knew then that I wanted her to be a part of it, not because I liked her, but because it's what my son wanted, too." Leslie nodded empathetically. She could have been judgmental or made me prove I was worthy of marrying her son. Instead, she showed me grace and kindness. It doesn't mean we've always agreed on everything, but I can honestly say I respect her, which means anytime we do disagree on something, I'm willing to at least try to understand her point of view. Listening to the older women talk was like getting snatches from a completely different world. Why was it so important to both of you that you get along? "Eric," they said together and laughed. Leslie took a sip of her smoothie. "It was important to Eric that not only did I like his parents, but that they liked me too. He was close to them, and I wouldn't have wanted to be the person who changed that dynamic, if that makes sense." "Exactly," Grandma nodded. "It was the same for us. Clearly our son, who we wanted to continue to have a close relationship with, saw Leslie as someone special that he hoped to spend the rest of his life with. If we wanted to continue to be part of that life, we knew we needed to embrace her as well." She smiled at her daughter-in-law with genuine love in her eyes. "It was never difficult to do. Just like it's never been difficult for us to welcome you into our family." Leslie reached over and covered Abby's hand with her own. The sincerity in her eyes matched the words she spoke. Abby shook her head in amazement. What these women were describing was something she'd never even seen between her own parents, much less in any of the other relationships they had. And that included their interactions with their own daughter. Since that was the case, no wonder neither of them, and Mom in particular, had even tried to give Tom a chance. Instead, they'd treated him like the enemy, pushed him away. And she'd let them. Or at least she hadn't stood up for him in any big way. Instead, she'd allowed her mom to talk badly about him nearly every day. Shouldn't Mom have been trying to get to know him instead? Shouldn't she have tried to find out what it was about him that Abby had fallen in love with in the first place? The realization sent zings of pain right to her core, quickly followed by regret. She tried to imagine what she would do if her child brought home the person he or she wanted to marry. Abby liked to think she'd be more like Grandma. Her eyes grew misty. "You two are lucky to have each other." As if they'd somehow discussed it first, both women stood and gathered around Abby to give her a hug. Their kindness sent tears flowing down her cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart," Leslie patted her back. "Whatever is going on, I hope you know that we're always here for you, too." Abby nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had no control over her tears and let them fall freely for several moments before swiping them away with a napkin and blowing her nose. Only then did Grandma and Leslie take their seats again. Yes, Abby was fortunate to be welcomed into this family. She wished she could say the same for Tom and her own parents. "I'm sorry, God. I let Tom down. I'm sorry I didn't do more to let him know how important he was to me, to show my parents that as well. If I had," she sniffed, "please show me how to start making a difference now." Chapter 14. Tom may not have caught much while fishing, but it sure felt good to get away from it all and enjoy the lull of the waves. Besides, he'd only been ocean fishing once before and had forgotten how fun it was. "I don't know about you all, but I'm looking forward to some barbecue tonight." Dad rubbed his hands together. Tom nodded. A well-known barbecue pit on the island cooked up food people supposedly wrote home about. The family planned to eat an early dinner there before boarding the cruise ship again. Tom's stomach growled in anticipation. Their boat headed back to land, and as much as Tom had enjoyed fishing with his family, he looked forward to reconnecting with Abby again. Hopefully she'd had a fun day. He wished they could have spent more of it together, but it had done him some good to get away and clear his head. "You okay?" The question came from Dad. Tom hadn't realized his thoughts had been written all over his face. He nodded. "Yeah." He glanced at Will, who gave him a nod of encouragement. "Things between Abby and me have been weird lately. I guess I've been hoping this cruise will be a fresh start for us." He turned away from the bow of the ship to find both Dad and Grandpa studying him thoughtfully. Uncle Peter and Will were clearly listening, but busied themselves with getting the fishing gear in order. Dad leaned against the railing. "Did I ever tell you that your mom and I had some marital trouble before you boys were born?" That had Tom's full attention, and even Will dropped all pretense that he was interested in the fishing gear. Tom blinked. "I had no idea." Dad nodded. "We argued regularly for a while and just couldn't see eye to eye on several issues. Oh, there was plenty of blame to go around. Finally, your mom decided to leave and stay with her parents for a few days. That's when I knew that this was more than just a quarrel that would resolve itself over time." He shrugged. "But I was stubborn. And so was your mom, if you can believe that." He chuckled and threw them a wink. Tom knew for a fact that both of his parents had a stubborn streak. After all, he'd certainly inherited one of his own. "What did you do? Clearly you worked things out." "We did. But it didn't happen overnight.
Your mom came home again, but it was a daily decision for us both to set our differences aside, to forgive each other, and to put our love and our marriage first.
Dad rubbed his palms on his pants and stood again.
It wasn't easy in the beginning, but what originally started out as a conscious effort soon became second nature. That's the secret, Grandpa spoke from the stool he sat on. You choose your marriage each day. You choose to love your spouse, even if it might be hard to do sometimes. And trust me, your grandma can make it difficult some days.
His serious demeanor creaked as his face broke into a big grin.
But I guarantee you, I make it even harder.
Everyone laughed at that as the dock came into view.
Just remember, son, there will always be issues. But if you choose each other, you choose your marriage, and ask God for guidance, then you can deal with those issues together.
Grandpa held up a finger.
Throwing in a little romance never hurts, either.
That brought another round of laughter. Tom chuckled as his thoughts centered around Abby and how the last month or two of their marriage had played out. When he'd chosen to leave and stay with Will, he hadn't consciously chosen his marriage or Abby. In fact, the only examples of marriage Abby had to learn from growing up were those that fell apart at the drop of a hat. Her parents never committed themselves fully to anyone else. And by walking away, even if it was only meant to give them both time to think, he abandoned her when she needed him most. Regret stung as surely as salt water in an open wound. He wanted to make things right with Abby, to fly back to Clearwater and leave the airport for home, together. Was it too late for that? The thought of not being in the same house, raising his son or daughter together, made him sick. He couldn't imagine himself growing old with anyone else but her. Now, he regretted simply giving her that bracelet and note and letting her read it later. He should have said those words to her face this morning before letting her out of his sight. At least then he wouldn't be here second-guessing everything. At least then he'd know where they stood. Dad cleared his throat, bringing Tom's attention back to him.
Can we pray for you and Abby?
Tom nodded.
I'd like that.
His voice sounded gruff, even to his own ears. The male members of his family gathered around, each placing a hand on Tom's shoulders. Dad began, with Grandpa joining partway through as they prayed for God's blessings on Tom and Abby's marriage. It was a humbling and freeing experience to have so many people supporting them. Peace settled over Tom's heart for the first time in way too long. By the time they got back to land and cleaned up, Tom couldn't wait to find Abby. When he finally spotted her, she was with his mom and grandmother. Her face looked relaxed as she laughed, the gentle island breeze blowing her hair. Her gaze shifted and tangled with his. She offered him a little smile, which he readily returned as he weaved through the crowd to her side. Tom put an arm around her shoulders and hugged her close.
Hey, beautiful. Looks like you've been having a good day.
He noticed the bracelet on her wrist. That had to be a good sign, right? I really have. She smiled up at him. How about you? Catch anything?
Not much, but we had fun, and I learned a lot.
He released his wife to greet Mom and Grandma.
Did you ladies buy out the island, or did you leave a few things for the other tourists?
Grandma wagged a finger at him.
How can you ask us such a question? Of course we left a few things for the other tourists.
She shared a mischievous look with Mom and Abby.
We could only fit so much in our luggage for the trip home.
The ladies laughed together. It made Tom's heart happy to see Abby getting along so well with his family. He focused on her.
I look forward to seeing what all you found.
She ducked her chin a little before raising her long lashes to look at him again. Something there in her eyes had him longing to steal her away so they could talk, just the two of them. But it would have to wait. The other family members joined them then, And all talk centered around the barbecue pit and whether it could rival Texas barbecue back home. As a group, they headed that direction where they would spend their final hour on the island before boarding the ship again for their last night at sea. As soon as Tom entered their room behind Abby, he closed the door. He watched in amusement as she kicked off her sandals and allowed herself to fall backward onto the bed with a loud groan. "I am so tired. I don't think I've ever walked as far in one day as I did with your mom and Grandma." Her voice brimmed with humor. "Those women can shop." She sat up again. "I found some pretty amazing treasures while we were there. But I have to say, I don't think any of them compared to this." She lifted her arm, and the bracelet he'd made for her shimmered. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He stepped forward, pleased that she liked it so much. He took her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her wrist. "I really wish we didn't need to hurry to my grandparents' reception." Tom couldn't express that enough. "Me too." Abby wrinkled her cute little nose. "And I have to jump in the shower quick and change." She glanced at the bathroom in regret. "I'll hurry. Will you wait for me?" "Of course." He'd wait for her all night if that's what it took. He was awarded with a brilliant smile. "I found something new to wear to the reception." She rummaged around in another bag until she pulled out a green blouse that perfectly matched her eyes. It'd look gorgeous on her. He nodded his approval. "It's perfect, Abby." "I also found these." She opened her shoulder bag. "I put them in here so I wouldn't lose them." She got her paperback out and dropped it on the bed. A moment later, she withdrew a small card and held it out triumphantly. "Earrings to match." The green stones glimmered. She was right. They'd look great with the blouse. "It's almost like they were made to go together." He imagined her wearing them and immediately wanted to kiss that soft spot on her neck, just below her ear. "Okay, I'll hurry." She gave him a soft look that had his heart leaping with hope for the future. Tom wasn't sure what it was, but there was something different about Abby. A good different. He couldn't wait for her to come out so that they could talk about his note and see if they were on the same page. He was almost as nervous now as he was when he first asked her to marry him. He quickly changed into a pair of black slacks and a button-up shirt for the reception. Then he sat on the bed to put his shoes back on. That's when he noticed Abby's paperback sitting close to the edge of the bed. He moved it over so it wouldn't fall, causing a piece of paper to slide out. Tom didn't want her to lose her place, so he picked the book up and began to slip the piece of paper back in, when he realized it was a business card. The words beneath the name caught his eye. "Divorce lawyer." His heart stalled. Numb, he dropped both on the bed as though they'd suddenly caught fire, his shoes forgotten. Why was she carrying around a divorce lawyer's business card as a bookmark? And more importantly, had she already made the call? Surely this was his mother-in-law's doing. But if Abby didn't have any plans to pursue it, wouldn't she have tossed the card? The very idea that his mother-in-law might have the opportunity to share her hatred of him with their child made his stomach churn. Would she try to turn his son or daughter against him, too? He shoved his feet into his shoes and tied the laces with way more force than necessary. He briefly considered pretending he hadn't seen it and waiting to see if Abby would come clean. But if he'd learned anything from today and the last month as a whole, it was that walking away from or ignoring a situation wasn't going to change it. He'd wait for Abby to come out, ask her point blank, and finally get some answers. They both deserved that. After what seemed like an eternity, the bathroom door opened and Abby emerged. The khaki skirt she wore looked perfect with her new green blouse, but nothing compared to the brilliant smile on her face. That smile fell away the moment she looked at him. "What's wrong?" Tom lifted a hand, the divorce lawyer's business card held between two fingers. "Do you want
A divorce. His voice was calm, even, not at all like the emotions tangled inside. Abby flinched and reached for the card, but he shifted it away from her. She shook her head. Where did you find that? Tom pointed to the bed without looking at it. It fell out of your book. It's not what you think. Tears filled her eyes, and she blinked rapidly. Mom gave that to me. And you kept it. No! Well, yes, but... She groaned as one hand clenched into a fist. Mom wanted me to take it last week. When I told her I didn't need it, she must have slipped it into my book. She sank onto the edge of the bed and buried her face in her hands. When she lifted her head again to look at him, her eyes swirled with a mixture of anger, desperation, and a silent plea. I don't want a divorce. I never wanted one, Tom. But I was afraid you would after this trip. Tom could see the truth in her eyes. He sat down next to her on the bed and took her hands in his. I don't want a divorce either. I realized today that leaving the house was a mistake. I thought it would give us time to think, that we both come to the right conclusions on our own. He raked his fingers through his hair, frustrated that it took him so long to get things figured out. I should have stayed. We should have prayed and talked things through. Together. I should have stood up for you when it came to my family. Abby sniffed and pulled her hands from his as she got to her feet again. You're the most important person in my life, Tom. But I should have made that clear to my parents. And by doing that, proven it to you as well. I'm sorry. She shook her head. All I could think about today was how amazing your family has been to me, and that you deserve the same. You were right when you said I need to distance myself from my mom. Being around her negativity every day hasn't been good for me. She clasped her hands together in front of her. My parents, and my mom in particular, have made a habit of pushing everyone away. It breaks my heart to realize I've been doing that to you. Another tear found its way down her cheek. This time, Tom stood and gently used the pad of his thumb to wipe it away. You can't push me away, Abigail Sinclair. Haven't you figured out by now that I'm too stubborn for that? She giggled then and nodded. Her smile faltered. She placed a palm to her belly. Everything's going to change. And things were difficult before... He wasn't about to let her finish that sentence. He covered her hand with his. This baby is a blessing, Abby, and the newest in a long list of reasons for why I want to come home. The two of you are my family. We belong together. Tom watched in wonder as Abby smiled up at him. The tears of sorrow in her eyes transformed into tears of joy. There's nothing I want more. She stepped into his arms then, and Tom held her close. His mouth sought hers in a kiss full of promise, like a man deprived of water for far too long. He relished her sweetness as he deepened their kiss. The last thing he wanted to do was step back, but if they didn't get moving, they would be late to the reception, an idea he seriously entertained. Tom held both of her hands in his. Will you allow me to escort you, Mrs. Sinclair? The corners of her mouth tugged upward, and her eyes sparkled as she slipped her arm into his. After all we've been through, I have one condition. Oh? And what might that be? He raised an eyebrow at her, truly curious. No matter what happens, don't ever kiss me goodbye again, okay? I think we've had enough of that to last a lifetime. Promise me we'll work everything out from now on. Her voice caught. He gathered her in his arms and held her tight. That I can do. I love you, Abby. I love you too. Always
and forever. Epilogue. Abby caught another glimpse of her reflection in the full-length mirror. The wedding dress fell to the floor in gentle waves of white. The bodice hugged her just right, and the lace trim gave the whole dress a breathless and almost fairy tale-like feel. When she had married Tom at the courthouse, she never imagined having a more formal ceremony later. But after the cruise ended, he'd asked her to marry him again. He wanted to renew their vows in front of their whole family, the way they should have done it in the first place. She loved the idea. Tom's family had been thrilled, and his mom had jumped right into helping Abby plan everything. Since they wanted something simple at the church, details came together in less than 2 months. Abby only wished her own parents had been as excited. Dad had seemed somewhat ambivalent to their decision. Mom had been sure to voice all the reasons why this was a horrible idea. She was even more upset when Abby shared her desire to quit working and stay home with the baby once he or she was born. But she stood her ground. She'd made it clear that it was their decision, and she didn't want to hear any more negative comments. In fact, ever since the cruise, Abby hadn't tolerated her parents' negativity toward Tom or their marriage. There were 2 weeks where she didn't speak to them at all until they both called and apologized. Dad offered to walk Abby down the aisle, to which she immediately agreed. Things were still weird with Mom, but they were getting better. Still, neither of her parents had been in the same room since her high school graduation. Abby sent up a silent prayer that they'd stay civil long enough to make it through the ceremony. She placed a hand over her belly, and the tiny baby nestled inside. If nothing else, the dysfunctional family cycle would end with Abby and Tom. She'd do everything in her power to make sure of that. Mandy peeked her head into the small dressing room. "You're on. Are you ready for this?" Abby smoothed back a strand of hair and gave a decisive nod. "Very ready. Thanks again for being my maid of honor." She smiled at her friend. "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss it. Come on. Let's not keep your guy waiting." They walked together down the hall to the entrance of the sanctuary where Dad was waiting for her. He smiled, his eyes suspiciously moist. "You look lovely, Abigail." "Thanks, Dad." He took her arm and threaded it through his, resting his hand protectively over hers. The ceremony began as Mandy preceded them into the sanctuary. When it was finally their turn to step into the large space, Abby's attention immediately went to Tom. He stood at the end of the aisle, Will by his side, and it was as though his gentle smile and the love in his eyes drew her toward him. "Thank you, Father, for bringing us here." The moment Dad placed her hand in Tom's, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. They went through their vows until the pastor spoke loudly. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has brought together, let no man separate." He gave Tom a nod. "You may kiss your bride." As Tom gently held her in his arms, Abby knew with everything in her that she was home. He was home, always and forever. Thank you for listening. This has been Marrying Abby, a novella for the Brides of Clearwater series by Melanie D. Snitker, read for you by Lynn Marie Brunk. Look for all of the Brides of Clearwater series on Amazon or Audible.